Look at me.
Constance.
Yeah,
Constance, Arabella, you are.
Right, where's your child? Have we searched for it?
Sooner you tell us.
So just to clarify, you just told me the baby that we found this evening is your baby.
In late November 1949, King George and Queen Mary attended a dazzling society wedding at James's Palace. The bride was Queen Mary's goddaughter, Mary Ann Marten, a glamorous heiress who owned one of England's most beautiful country homes, Crichel House in Dorset, England. Crichel House is an 18th century Georgian estate in Dorset. It has a Grade 1 listed house, which has more than 25 rooms, a ballroom and a wine cellar, with a 400-acre park and lake. Mary actually had to fight for this back, but that's a story that's way out of scope of this very long video. If you're interested, look up the Crichel Down affair. A decade after the wedding, in 1959, Mary gave birth to a son who would be called Napier Marten. Napier grew up in the house as intended. Educated at Eton College, he served as a page of honour to Queen Elizabeth II, a distinction which is granted to the teenage sons of members of nobility. Then in 1986, at the age of 27, Napier married a socialite named Virginie Camus. She was a Belgian-born psychotherapist, which came from an equally distinguished lineage. Her family also owned property, moved in elite social circles, and had a long-standing connection to the British high society. Still living in Crichel House, Napier and Virginie started a family, having 3 children together. The eldest of these children was their only daughter, and she is very much the focus of this story. Her name is Constance Marten, born on the 16th of May 1987. A year on, in 1988, she would gain a brother, then another one 3 years later in 1991. This made her the eldest sister of 2 brothers, for the time being at least. There would be more brothers in the future. One of his brothers struggled to pronounce Constance. In his mangled attempts, it had come out as Toots, and with her only being young herself, the affectionate nickname stuck. Soon she became known to almost everyone by the nickname of Toots. She would even go on to use this name online and in interviews. Constance was educated in Dorset. She spent her childhood years in a very exclusive girls' preparatory boarding school, Hanford's Prep School. Crichel House welcomed another baby boy in about 1994-1995, making 8-year-old Constance now the eldest daughter with 3 brothers. A year or so later, in 1996, when Constance was just 9, her dad Napier, who had what's been called a midlife awakening. He reportedly had voices in his head. He had these visions, these out-of-body experiences, and he did what these voices told him to do. He shaved his head and flew to Australia, leaving his family behind. Napier travelled the world, reportedly on a journey of spiritual discovery, pursuing his love for nature. Much of this finding himself phase occurred in Australia. He turned his back on the traditional expectations of his aristocratic background. He worked as a chef and lived a Nordic existence in a converted lorry, a completely different life from the aristocratic one he'd just escaped. It was during this time that he became interested in craniosacral therapy, a form of alternative medicine intended to relieve pain and tension through gentle manipulation of the skull. Even when he did eventually return to the UK, which were no time soon, he didn't immediately jump back into the landed gentry lifestyle. Instead, he continued to practice alternative therapies and lived a life that was in many ways non-mainstream. But of course, he had the family wealth to fall back on. Napier later reflected back to before he left, saying, "Everything in my life, materially, was just a completely empty shell." It's said that Napier leaving Crichel House and the UK marked the separation of him and Virginie, although at least some say that that could have happened up to 2 years before. With him gone, life at home carried on, with Virginie taking care of her children, albeit, especially when Constance were concerned, they were in boarding school. Around now, Constance, who was growing up fast, started to attend the £30,000 a year St Mary's private school in Shaftesbury, where she had a reputation of being a bit of a rebel. This school was very prestigious. It's the same school Queen Camilla's daughter had previously been a pupil of. Only being a 30-minute drive away from home, it's unclear if Constance visited home at weekends or just at half term, but she definitely did board. Either way, Napier being gone was a big change to this stable aristocratic background, especially to the household. Then in 1998, with Constance being 11-year-old, her mom married Guy Decellier, a wealthy Belgian investment banker, and subsequently she moved the family to London. Constance did live with her mom and stepdad when she weren't at boarding school, and they did have an occasionally stormy relationship, as like most parents do with teenagers. But family and friends insist that these storms, these arguments, were rarely over anything serious. But still, throughout her childhood and school life, the warm and easygoing Constance Marten was popular with her peers. They regarded her as fun-loving, if sometimes a little rebellious and mischievous. An example of Constance's antics would be an incident during preparations for a school photograph. She'd opted to wear a pair of thick bottle-bottom joke spectacles, telling the photographer that these glasses were special glasses designed to prevent her from having seizures when the camera flashed. The glasses were eventually removed, but that weren't enough for Constance. She had to keep it up, so she squinted through the photograph while her friends tried to hold in their giggles. The headmistress, Mrs. McScriggan, was so furious that she'd threatened to send the photographs to be edited, with Constance removed, and send the bill to Constance's mom. This strict Roman Catholic school placed a lot of emphasis on discipline and religion, with pupils required to obey a strict code of conduct and attend mass regularly. But this endless list of school rules served only to fuel Constance's rebellious streak. And as you can already start to imagine, she clashed with the school authorities. She notices that she's surrounded by rules and she has to act and behave in a certain way, when in actual fact she just wants to take life a little bit easier. So already in Constance's early years, there is this picture that's starting to build of a girl that's got a problem with authority. A problem with being constantly told what she must do and how she must live, with such great and high expectations placed upon her. But despite her privileged upbringing, Constance often appeared uncomfortable with these rigid expectations. And as time went on, it only seemed to get worse. Constance wanted independence. She wanted to make her own life choices. And over time, that desire would only lead her further and further away from the world in which she'd grown up in. It was after finishing school in 2006, when Constance was 19 and on a gap year, that her mom took her to a now infamous pilgrimage to Nigeria. This had come after her mom had introduced her to the Holy Trinity, Brompton, one of Britain's most renowned evangelical churches, which had become popular with the high-profile figures such as Jerry Halliwell and Bear Grylls. Together they visited a church called the Synagogue Church of All Nations in Lagos. Exactly what happened while teenage Constance was there is unclear, but we do know that she was hand-picked by its pastor, T.B. Joshua, for a longer stay. Constance's mom then returned to the UK. Her daughter stayed behind to become a disciple there after being hand-picked. And this visit clearly had a profound impact. Constance later said her experience left her completely broken apart. She was apparently forced to live in a dormitory with 50 other women, under the watchful eye of armed guards. They were starved, woken at night for Bible readings, and made to call the pastor, T.B. Joshua, Daddy. Constance later recalled, "The leader looked me in the eye and said, 'Your family doesn't matter anymore. I'm your father now.'"
No, you're not. There's armoured guys outside each of the doors.
Okay, touch on that.
Okay.
That's a good point, yeah.
There's guys with guns outside each of the main entrances and exits. And TB Joshua, Daddy, would say that's for our own safety because the streets in Nigeria are so dangerous. Whether that's true is completely debatable. Obviously, Nigeria isn't the safest place to be in, but we obviously weren't allowed to leave the church, and we weren't allowed to use internet. You weren't allowed any contact with your family. I was specifically told when I joined, I had to hand in my phone to TB Joshua. There was no letters that could be written to you, because he said to us that if something detrimental happens to your family, then it will deter you off track from God. So it's better not to know. And I remember I was meant to go on my gap year with my best friend, and I had no way. We bought our flight tickets, and I didn't tell her that I was stuck in this place because there was no way of speaking to her. And I once tried to sneak into the internet department to try and email my mum. And the next day I got called into Daddy's office, and someone had obviously seen, or there was a camera that saw me, and I got in trouble for that. So there's no way of, we weren't allowed to read outside sources or any books that we had to give in. So there was no way that you could even find anything against him or know anything about the outside world or Nigeria.
Did you see any abuse or anything like that, or anything abusive sort of behaviour towards people?
It's all mental abuse. It's a breakdown of your character that you don't realise. And whenever we used to have these secret meetings at 4 o'clock in the morning, he used to say a name of any one of the disciples. And he'd make them, so everyone would make them stand up. And this is in front of 100 people, all the disciples. And you're kind of half asleep. There's a lot of sleep deprivation that goes on. You get about 3 hours sleep. Some people got 1 hour sleep a night because they were constantly working, constantly. And he'd make them stand up. And everyone was allowed to stand up and hack that person's character to pieces and say, oh, this person's this person's that. And it would really break someone down, so they'd become more and more attached to Daddy, and it was the only way that they could become a wholesome person. So there was a lot of mental playing around with. Nothing so much physical. A lot of the Nigerian girls said that physical things went on with them, but I don't think he would dare touch a white person because he knows that we could get out in the press.
Okay.
And I think it's a really dangerous place to be. And I was only within the church for 6-7 months. And when I came out, I was a completely different person. I was unsociable. I couldn't talk to people. I didn't find anything funny. I was really shy. My whole character had switched. And that was only being in there for 6 months. Now I've got friends who've been there for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And if they ever realise that he was a phony, I honestly don't think they would be able to carry on living a normal life. Or I definitely don't think they'd be able to integrate back into society easily. And these are young people whose lives have just been wasted inside a compound where they don't leave. And I think that's exceptionally sad, because I don't think they want to.
Many of Constance's female peers have since alleged that Joshua assaulted, abused, and even raped them during their visits to Synagogue Church of All Nations. An author under the name of Johnson wrote about this in 2018 in a book, Deception of the Age Unmasked. TB Joshua would send for white girls to visit his bedroom upstairs, one after the other. He wooed them for sex. Now, there has been no direct suggestion that Constance herself was abused during her time there, but Johnson alleged that Constance Marten was one of Joshua's early foreign female disciples, and Constance herself did later describe how he would humiliate her and other white devotees. They were reportedly made to eat his leftover food and forced to cope on just a few hours sleep per night. A BBC Africa Eye investigation also found evidence of widespread abuse and torture under TB Joshua's leadership, including allegations of rape by Joshua himself and forced abortions spanning almost 20 years. That being said, TB Joshua died in 2021. The BBC, who called it a cult, also reported that while there, Constance got to know another disciple called Angie, who left the church after 10 years. She remembers Constance as bright, witty, compassionate, funny, kind, and independent. While telling the BBC a lot of what I've already said, she would also say that female disciples were asked to denounce each other in humiliating acts in public meetings. It's very hard to explain how scary that place was. It was a place of torture, psychological abuse, physical abuse, spiritual abuse, and sexual abuse. It's reported that Constance was thrown out, while other reports simply state that she suddenly left with the help of a mom, and apparently blamed her mom for having introduced her to the evangelical world that led her there to start with. And it wasn't only Constance that claimed that the trip broke her. Even a friend back home said that Constance was never the same again. She always used to be wild, but also happy, kind of buoyant. She was darker when she came back, and she found things more difficult. By 2008, at the age of 21, Constance had applied for and been accepted a place at Leeds University to do Arabic and Middle Eastern studies. She embraced university life from the start. According to one university friend, she enjoyed life in the gritty north, and she appeared to revel in the relative poverty of student life compared with her upbringing. It was while doing those studies that she appeared in September 2008's edition of Tatler magazine as Babe of the Month, under the name of Constance Marten. With a very glamorous looking full page picture, the feature also hosted a brief Q&A. She answered that her favourite place was on top of a Matterhorn mountain which she'd recently summited. Her favourite drink was cider, joking that she viewed it as one of her 5 a day. Her future plans were to get a tattoo of a tortoise on the bottom of her foot, and her party trick was crushing a can of Coke between her shoulder blades, stating, "Envisage a human recycling machine." As her studies went on, she spent her 3rd year in Cairo, the capital of Egypt. Her time there coincided with the unrest across the country as the Arab Spring swept across the region. Excited to be at the centre of such world events, Constance began taking photos of the mass protests at Tahrir Square and later won awards for her work. Then in 2012, after graduating with a 2:1, she took up a role as a senior researcher at London Bureau of Al Jazeera, the media network, with aspirations of becoming a journalist. According to her LinkedIn profile, she worked as a researcher for the weekly investigative documentary programme People and Power. She was assistant producer for a film to be aired in 2015, pitched an idea for a documentary about a religious cult in Nigeria, wrote, researched and investigated the corruption charges and illegal activities of the group, tackled down former members of the sect in the UK, Nigeria, Ghana and South Africa in order to gather solid first-hand information, conducted and collected all prima facie evidence to warrant undercover filming, planned and investigated all undercover filming procedures, sought out people to interview and persons connected to each weekly investigation. She also translated and transcribed interviews in Arabic and English. Now, while she was fluent in classical and modern Arabic, she hoped she would get a chance to cover stories out in the field. But she became increasingly frustrated that her ideas weren't being picked up by more senior colleagues. An associate from around that period said her woeful timekeeping was part of her inability to be taken serious. She would pretty much keep her own hours and come and go as she pleased. She was well liked, but just a bit unreliable, which is not the best way to get on when you're just starting out. It was also in 2012, so either just before her Al Jazeera job or not long after starting, that she talked about what happened at the Church of All Nations in a message. "I haven't spoken to anyone about what happened at the synagogue." She went on to say that she never wanted to believe that it were a cult, and it's taken me years to get back to normal. Her time at Al Jazeera lasted roughly 11 months. It's also around this time and period that her friend claimed that she was in an unhappy relationship with a boyfriend and that ended badly and left her emotionally vulnerable. In August 2013, Constance took a job as a project manager for Rich Mix, a creative charity in East London, but the role only lasted 2 to 3 months. It was while working here that she won the photography awards, one of which was taken during the unrest in Cairo. It was also about this time in 2013 that Constance's brother, who had been handed over Chichel House after their father had returned, he sold the estate for £32 million to a US hedge fund billionaire. But I am led to believe it was a trust-held estate, which means that money isn't his to keep. That money goes into the massive web of trust funds that the family has, and Constance is one of the beneficiaries of these funds. By January 2014, now at the age of 27, she'd been accepted on a 5-month National Council for Training of Journalists course run by the Press Association in central London. She became professionally qualified as a journalist and spent a day interning at Daily Mail. It seems from this part of her life she really began touting herself as a freelance photojournalist, but commissions were few and far between. However, this is Constance, so with her wide circle of friends and access to a generous trust fund that gave her monthly allowances up to £2,500, her life were never dull. But by now, as Constance is entering her late 20s, her friends were starting to settle down. But Constance Marten still appeared to be searching for something to give her life meaning. She then moved into a house share in the Leytonstone area of East London, and she enrolled on a drama course at the East 15 Acting School in Essex. She would drive there every day. A writer who was also on the course describes her as down-to-earth and friendly. Toots was the total opposite of a stereotypical posh woman. She was very helpful and warm, always saying hello to cleaners and even the handymen. I used to make fun of her a lot. She's fond of breaking wind at spontaneous times. She had absolutely no shame. I used to say, maybe that's why they call you Toots. She's just very unlike any aristocratic person. But Constance fell behind in class, despite fellow students remarking on her natural acting talents. I detected a lot of issues with her. She had a lot of problems with her family, and spoke of how her parents were not being supportive of her ambitions. She always felt like her parents didn't quite understand her. While Constance didn't hide her aristocratic roots, it appeared she carried a certain amount of guilt about them, especially a distant family connection to Oswald Mosley. If you're into your political history, or even the Peaky Blinders TV series, you'll probably know of Oswald Mosley. He was an English politician who spearheaded the nation's fascist movement for nearly 40 years. As the leader of both the British Union of Fascists and post-World War II, the Union movement. Although it wasn't actually a blood relationship, a paternal aunt once married one of the sons of Oswald Mosley, but that didn't stop Constance being embarrassed or ashamed of the matter. This friend recalls, "She did tell me one time, I hope you're not going to be angry with me if I tell you this. I'm related to Oswald Mosley." I was like, you can't help who you're related to. It's also reported that she told her friends at this drama school that she was the black sheep of her family. She was estranged from her parents, but still good friends with one of her brothers. Constance was due to graduate from East 15 Acting School in July 2016. But around 2 months before the course ended, she dropped out. As well as having fallen behind in her coursework, something, or rather someone, had entered her life. Mark Gordon's mom, Sylvia, came to the UK as one of the Windrush generation. She married Lucille Satchel, also from Jamaica, and with him she had 4 children. But the marriage was over by the time she was pregnant with Mark, her 5th child. She gave birth to him in 1974. Born in London to a single mom, Mark Gordon grew up in inner city Birmingham, where his childhood was fractured and full of disruption. Being the youngest of 5 children, he never knew his father. He refused to meet him or support him financially. He had a pretty much traumatic start to his life, including his formative years. His older sister told the BBC he was a shy boy, but he could be a little bit mischievous. While Mark Gordon was still young, his mom left her job as a nurse at the Chrysler car factory in the Midlands, and then they moved to the US. They initially settled in New York, moving into an apartment in the Bronx. Mark was enrolled into a local middle school where he was apparently a grade A student and expressed ambition to become a doctor. Then in the summer of 1888, his mom took him on a visit to Florida to visit a cousin. He was so enchanted by the orange trees for the first time, he begged her to move to Florida. She had her concerns about the crime in New York, so she agreed, and in early 1989 they relocated, renting a house on a quiet palm tree lined street in Miami. Mark, who was still fixated on becoming a doctor, was enrolled at the local Hallandale High School, but he struggled to make friends and began skipping class. According to his mom, he spent most of his time by himself in his bedroom, and it was around this time that he developed an obsession with pornography, reading magazines, and watching the Playboy channel. Then, in April 1989, just 2 months after moving to the area, at the age of 14-year-old, Mark Gordon committed some unspeakable crimes. Armed with a kitchen knife and some edge clippers, he broke into a neighbour's house and subjected her to a 4.5-hour rape ordeal. In the weeks leading up to the attack, he'd used a ladder to spy on the victim, whose house was only yards away from his own backyard. At around 5:30 in the morning, on April the 29th, 1989, dressed in dark clothing with a pair of tights covering his face, he climbed through the bathroom window. Alerted by the family dog, this victim, who was a single mother, went into the living room to confront him. He was armed and partially disguised in tights, and she began screaming. But Mark threatened that he'd kill her children if they were only sleeping in the next room. He ordered her to go back into her bedroom, so of course she did. And that's when he subjected her to hours and hours of rape and sexual assaults, threatening to slit her throat. He was only 14-year-old. At around 8 o'clock, her 7-year-old daughter and 9-year-old son began knocking on the bedroom door. They were concerned as to why their mom hadn't got up. Fearing that Mark might harm them like he'd threatened to, she tried to keep them calm, saying that she had a headache and she'd be up soon. Eventually, she managed to persuade him to go, and he did, he fled. Decades later, this victim told the Telegraph it was so strange, so odd, that it couldn't have been normal. The fact that he didn't talk other than to order me around. He was almost non-human. He was just an evil being. Just weeks after that attack, on the 21st of May, he struck again. After luring a family dog out of the house, he removed a window before climbing inside. This time he was armed differently. He just had a spade, but he had gone round the house, strategically placing kitchen knives. He crept past a sleeping 1-year-old baby. He made his way into the master bedroom, but he'd made a fatal mistake. His intended victim was not alone. She was with her husband. Her husband heroically leapt out of bed and confronted him. Mark, who at this moment is only 2 weeks away from his 15th birthday, used the spade to hit the husband, but unrelentingly to protect his family. Even with blood pouring from a gaping wound on his head, the husband was able to chase Mark out of the property. It was another 3 days after that a Florida detective knocked on the door of Mark's home, after neighbours reported seeing him acting suspiciously. Mark, who, let's not forget, is still not 15, was standing with his older brother, looking very nervous. I said, "Mark, if you did something, you did something. You know, you have to deal with it. If you didn't, you didn't. But you have got the rest of your life. You're just a kid." I didn't pressure him at all. I didn't say a word after that. I just went about my business, looking around. And he looked at me, and he said, "I did it. I went into her house." During his initial police interview, Mark claimed that someone called Jerome had forced him at gunpoint to commit the crimes, but he later relented and made a full confession. He was charged with multiple counts of armed sexual battery, armed kidnapping, armed burglary, and aggravated battery. And because of the serious nature of these offences, he was tried as an adult rather than in the juvenile court. In a statement to the court, his first victim described him as cruel and devious, and described how at one stage he told us to say goodbye to her children, telling her, "This is the day you're going to die." She pleaded with the judge. Someone who is capable of doing this, a cruel, calculated act, at this young age, is not going to get better. He is only going to do more harm to society. Please protect the innocent by keeping the guilty in prison for his life. Show him no mercy. And so it was. In March 1990, he was found guilty of 4 charges of sexual battery. The prosecutor of the case for the state said, "I was so offended by the brutality that this guy showed. He was a serial psychotic sociopath." During the sentencing, Mark's mom pled with the judge to show him leniency, outlining his difficult upbringing and the lack of a father figure. I just don't know where Mark went wrong. I don't know why things went the way they did. I worked very hard as a nurse, and I've tried to raise these kids to the best of my ability on my own. And to be fair, Mark would later say the idea I was underprivileged was not the case. My mom had 2 or 3 houses. She always provided for us. She showed empathy. Her words didn't do much. Mark Gordon was sentenced to 40 years in an American prison. And for someone that was only 14, 15-year-old, this punishment meant he would spend the vast majority of his youth the rest of his youth and his early adulthood behind bars. And that is exactly what happened. Mark spent the next 2 decades inside the Florida prison system. While the world outside changed dramatically during that time, Mark's life became defined by the rigid routines of incarceration. Mark served just over 20 years in that prison before he was eventually released. But his release did not mean he would be able to stay in the United States. Mark Gordon was not an American citizen, so immigration authorities moved to deport him once his prison term had ended. In January 2010, aged 35, Mark was released on parole and deported to the UK. Once in the UK, he had to sign the sex offenders register and keep police informed of his movements. Carrying his heavy past, he settled in East London and started working as a labourer in the construction industry. It's not quite clear what Mark Gordon did for the first 6 years that he was back in England, but Constance was busy rushing around trying to find what was missing from her life. She was trying to find her freedom, her independence, and she was soon set to finish acting school. Meanwhile, Mark was living in a ramshackle terraced home in Enfield, North London, opposite to a off-licence. It was in 2016 that a chance encounter in Tottenham, London, in a shop selling incense, brought Constance and Mark together. We met in a shop actually, in London. Yeah, then we went for coffee, and it just went on from there. Got lots of similarities, so same perspectives on life, things like that. He's my soulmate. As far as I can tell, it was this. Not her dad running off to another country for a couple of years to shake off the aristocratic life. Not a religious boarding school. Not even a cult. What would drastically change the course of Constance's life was a simple encounter with a man in a shop. Although that being said, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that all the factors I've just mentioned and more play majorly important roles on what's to come. I truly believe everything that happens from here on out is a result of the cocktail of events that was Constance's life up until meeting Mark Gordon. As I was saying at the end of Constance's introduction, it was about this time that she met Mark Gordon, that her relationship with her friends and family and her studies started to noticeably suffer, seemingly out of nowhere, leaving everybody wondering what had happened. It said they moved in together in Ilford, East London, as she shut out her old life. Her Facebook and Instagram, for example, seemed to have gone quiet for a couple of years. Her LinkedIn weren't really updated from 2014 onwards. It's reported that many people that knew Constance, or especially her family, for them the relationship was deeply concerning. Friends and relatives said Mark appeared to have a powerful influence over Constance. Her family apparently met Mark in the early days and were very apprehensive about the relationship. They did not warm to him at all. And as is often the case in that situation, she took offence. Members of the Marten family would later say they believed he was controlling, manipulative, and isolating her, cutting her off from the support network she'd grown up with her entire life. According to those close to Constance, her personality began to change as the relationship deepened. She became increasingly distant from her family, and as we've said a few times, distance between Constance and her family weren't really an unknown, but this time it was different, it was deeper. She'd been known to step away from a privileged background to go out into the world, to build an education and to build a career. But this time, it was to build a new life with Mark Gordon, a man with a violent and deeply troubling criminal past. Now, it seems like perspective plays a massively important role here. Her family are concerned about her welfare and they believe she's in an abusive and controlling relationship. And as we know from other videos, that's a really tough situation to try and combat. So as this case goes on, they frequently do things like hire private investigators in what they often claim was to check on her and her future children and make sure everyone was okay. However, from Constance's perspective, the family don't want her to be with Mark Gordon. He isn't the right person. He's not in the right social circles. He's not, well, he's a convict. He's not of that blue blood origin and they just shouldn't be together. She also says her family can be quite bigoted. In her view, The relationship and any children they had together were an embarrassment to their name and their status. It's her view that they wanted this relationship to end, so in response she becomes more defensive, reserved, and tries to hide more. She tries to become more private, become more free, away from this aristocratic style and the aristocratic expectations. But that only seems to create this vicious cycle, where people become more concerned, so they do more, but then that makes her more paranoid, and it just goes on and gets more and more extreme. Friends have said that when Constance and Mark met, or at least started dating, it was like Constance had suddenly discovered something that she'd been looking for her entire life. Thoughts that she'd previously had of a career in journalism or in the arts were suddenly extinguished. Mark Gordon was now her future. The couple quickly moved in together, taking advantage of Constance's access to the family trust fund, which paid her a monthly allowance, but also allowed her to apply for advances or one-off payments. In October 2016, her mum is believed to have hired London security group, private detectives, to trace Constance after she'd failed to attend a family holiday. This firm reportedly brought in an agency called CSM Partners to undergo surveillance on Constance and Mark. They even later arranged for her dad, Napier, to try approaching Mark in a cafe. But it was in 2016 that Mark and Constance went to Peru, where, according to one family member, or at least one family member, they attended a retreat and took ayahuasca, an hallucinogenic drink made from vine stems and shrub leaves, traditionally used in indigenous cultures in South America. It has become popular with Western New Age travellers seeking answers to complexities of modern life, which, let's face it, seems to fit the bill for both Constance and her dad. But it can also have negative effects, with some users suffering anxiety in the long term and panic attacks. And you've probably heard of this in some of my other cases or other cases elsewhere, because it is in a lot of brutal cases that include psychosis, where it turns out the perpetrator took this in the past at some point. Paranoia is recognised as a side effect, but it's typically only a temporary side effect. While in South America, the couple also took part in a local marriage ceremony, though this ceremony isn't recognised as a legal marriage in Britain. They'd travelled through the country during the later part of an outbreak of the Zika virus, which is known to affect the development of babies. In mid-2017, Constance and Mark finally returned from backpacking around South America. Apparently, on their return home, Constance sent a message to her family and friends telling them that she was effectively cutting off contact with them. A source close to her family told the press that, out of the blue, she sent a text saying she'd chosen to live her life in a different way. She told us this was her decision, and hers alone, freely made, and she did not want any of us to try and contact her again, not to try and meet up with her, and she wanted everyone to respect that, for better or worse. Another source added, it may appear to those on the outside that her family cut her off when she got together with Mark, but it was the other way around. It was Constance saying she didn't want anything to do with them. From here on in, the couple led a very isolated life, and as it often does, that led to at least two completely different narratives. It's reported over the next few years, even neighbours would say that they weren't very neighbourly, with some neighbours commenting that the couple rarely left the house, and when they did, it was often at night. The extent of this self-imposed isolation was painfully illustrated in 2021, when Constance's brother married Ruth Amer, a jewellery designer. Not only had it been Constance's brother's wedding, but Ruth had also been one of Constance's best friends. The lavish ceremony was attended by hundreds of guests and was featured in Vogue. But Constance wasn't there. Neither was Napier, for that matter. But let's not skip ahead to 2021, because that's way too far ahead and a lot happens in them 5 years. In fact, this is what this video is going to cover. In 2017, members of Constance's family were still concerned about their relationship. And up until this point, they hadn't known the full detail of Mark Gordon's criminal past. So they applied to the US authorities for the court papers, hoping to find out more. But unbeknown to them, by the time they discovered the full horror of his convictions, Constance was pregnant with her first child. And of course, Mark Gordon was the dad. It was in June 2017 that Constance went to St Mary's Hospital in London. It's reported that she'd gone to hospital for a separate medical matter, but while she was there, hospital staff discovered that she was 6 months pregnant. Concerns were raised that she'd not sought any NHS antenatal care, and Constance informed the staff that her and Mark had been living in a camper van which was nearby. It's important to know here that in the UK, that is 2 safeguarding flags right there. With Constance being 6 months pregnant, there having no medical records about the pregnancy, immediately flags as a concealed pregnancy. So the hospital is now legally required to notify social services. It's classed as a high-risk safeguarding issue. And to be fair, the procedure usually involves assessing reasons for concealment, such as fear, abuse, mental health issues, and it also involves managing risks post-birth. The second red flag here is she told them she lives in a camper van which is parked nearby, and that signals transience, meaning the authorities knew that she could vanish again at any moment. So the already concerned London hospital staff arranged future antenatal appointments and checkups, but Constance missed at least 2 more checkups and then disappeared. The couple had aspirations of living off-grid, but as a convicted rapist, Mark was required to inform the police of his whereabouts. It's part of being on the sex offenders register. It's also said that they'd managed to accumulate up to £6,000 worth of driving offences and parking fines. So as a result, they were aggressively being pursued by the bailiffs, requiring her family to instruct a solicitor on her behalf. At this point, her dad also hired private investigators to try and track them down, and the fines were eventually settled by the trust fund. With the pregnancy being classed as high risk, and them not turning up to the antenatal appointments, a national alert was triggered on the 26th of September 2017. This basically distributes across the NHS and social care network, so if a woman in question turns up at any hospital, they get flagged up. And yet, staff are trained to look for specific markers, like a lack of history or suspicious behaviour, and so on. If at any point their real name is put in to the central NHS spine, an alert pops up immediately to say that this person's got a national alert about them. And it was in early November that the early stages of labour with Constance's first child, that her and Mark turned up at Glenwheely Hospital in Carmarthen, South Wales. That's 213 miles away from the London hospital that they last attended. At this time, they were allegedly living in a tent on some wasteland near a supermarket car park in Carmarthen. Constance gave a fake name, Isabella O'Brien, and Mark the name James Amur. But of course, there was an issue again. There was no record of any antenatal care for this pregnancy on the NHS system under the name of Isabella O'Brien. Speaking with a fake Irish accent, Constance claimed to be from the travelling community and had been raised in a caravan. She said she was no longer in a relationship with her baby's dad, and that her family disapproved of a child being born out of wedlock. So she'd travelled from Leeds to avoid her family. She claimed to have never been to school, not to have been registered with a GP, and didn't even have an NHS number. She claimed that Mark, or James Amur, was a friend that she'd known for about a month and was definitely not the father of a child. She also said that she didn't have anything with her for the baby. Quite remarkably, Constance gave birth to her first child under the assumed identity of Isabella, while remaining the fake Irish accent. She maintained it throughout birth. But these identities started to be scrutinised when a social worker recalled the national alert. A row ensued on the maternity ward, and staff became so concerned that they called the police. The plan fell to bits when Constance's passport was found. But officers arriving at the scene at the hospital were a much bigger issue for them than you might first expect. Remember, Mark Gordon is on the sex offenders register, and he has to frequently inform police of his whereabouts. that, of course, they were living off-grid and trying to escape a system that they believe was trying to put control on them. So he hadn't been keeping contact with the police. And like I said, they're over 200 miles away from the last known whereabouts. So his way out of this, his genius plan, was to continue insisting his name was James Amur. But he blew his cover when he told police his date of birth was the 31st of April. Obviously, April only has 30 days. This was a blunder that would drastically escalate the situation. With the police pressing on and questioning Mark about his identity, he began to pace the room and started to say that he was confused. His game was up, but he weren't willing to admit it. He refused to sit down, and he tried to leave the room. But when officers tried to stop him, things got physical in front of other mothers and babies. He assaulted the 2 female police officers and was eventually brought under control after being PAVA sprayed and with additional assistance from a member of the public that was on the ward. He was arrested and on the 14th of November 2017 appeared at a local magistrates court where he pled guilty to 2 charges of assaulting a police officer and failing to comply with the requirements of the sex offender register. He was jailed for 12 weeks and fined £415. In all, that led him to miss the first week of his newborn baby's life, who was born in November. So now they're in a really bad situation. In just a few months, there's this concealment of the pregnancy, then the not attending further antenatal appointments, the fake identities at the hospital, Mark being on the register, and now is being violent towards police and being convicted. It's massively disputed why things happened this way. Constance will later say that she faked her name because she was trying not to be detected by her family, and from her perspective, I can understand that as an excuse. But the other side says it's because she'd missed all the antenatal appointments and Mark Gordon was on the register. Because of these red flags, social services would be involved, so that's why she did it. But for me, that doesn't make sense. Why didn't she just attend the meetings and say the baby's dad was the result of a one-night stand so she doesn't know who he is? To me, avoiding the detection of a family is the most plausible reason for everything that led up to this point. Either which way, things would only go from bad to worse. Soon after, social services who were bound to be involved from long before the baby were even born, they discovered that despite it being winter, Constance was living in a tent in the woods with little, if any, provisions for a newborn baby. It's claimed that one social worker was shocked to find that the tent was bowing under the weight of rainfall and it was full of bags of rubbish and bottles of wee. It was around this time that social workers also expressed concerns that Constance would often fall asleep with the baby and was warned about the dangers of overlaying, aka accidental suffocation. And that is common advice for new mums. I can remember my children being born and I think there were leaflets, there were things on TVs, there were posters all about overlaying. It's a big no-no, especially if you've had a drink or if you're overly tired. Constance told social workers that visited the hospital that her and Mark had been evicted from their flat in London and had therefore lived in a camper van. She also told them that they'd moved to Wales to get away from her family, but had struggled with the homeless community there, so she thought if they'd have posed as travellers, they'd get social housing. And that's something she stuck with. She pled that they were homeless and didn't know how they'd meet the needs of this newborn baby in their current situation. But at the same time, she was saying that she's a capable woman and she would arrange housing and state benefits to help take care of this child. However, she also admitted that up to that point, she had not made any inquiries about state benefits. So in response, she was advised that it's not a quick process, it can take months. And a social worker also explained to her that the social services had a number of concerns, including falsifying names, and that the 2 of them had been living in the tent. So Constance assured them that she'd engage with social service professionals and that the baby was her priority. When asked if she had any provisions for this baby, she said that she had some clothing and some nappies, to which they responded by informing her that that was simply not enough for a newborn baby to be safe. It were in November 2017 that Constance were advised to reach out to a family and attempt to secure housing, and that there was inadequate preparations for a baby, a court order would be sought, if she were unable to establish a suitable home for herself and the baby. Eventually, an interim care order was made in relation to the newborn. An interim care order is made by a family court. It basically means that the court believes there are some serious concerns about the child's safety, and the local authority temporarily shares the parental responsibility with the parent while the case is being investigated. Part of the local authority's responsibilities is the ability to decide where the child lives. This means that the child could be placed in foster care with relatives or in a mother and baby placement. The order is temporary, initially lasting up to 8 weeks, although they can be renewed every 4 weeks, and they can continue while care proceedings are ongoing. In this case, Constance and the baby were subject to a number of mother and baby placements, which are specialist accommodations where a mom and a baby live together while trained staff observe how a parent cares for the child, and social workers assess whether a parent can safely care for this baby in the long term. It's pretty much a 24-hour supervision, including the monitoring of feeding, sleeping and safety. There's obviously parenting guidance available, and they write reports for the courts. It's reported that while Constance was there were questions about her ability to safely care for this child. Social workers apparently found bottles of wine in a room and warned Constance once again about the risks of sleeping with a baby on her chest, and that is a piece of advice that has been said to her more than once. In December 2017, during talks with a social worker, Constance appeared to accept some of the concerns, but maintained that everyone has the right to choose where they live, and her remark should not be penalised or discriminated against because of a lifestyle that they chose to live wasn't mainstream. Finally, in July 2018, care proceedings concluded, in which a psychiatrist warned that Mark Gordon had a capacity to act in a violent manner and could be violent under stress. The interim order had ceased after 35 weeks and 9 court hearings. Instead, a supervision order was made, which allows Constance and Mark to take care of the child on their own under the supervision of social services. This is basically a huge step forward. The child stays with the parents, but a local authority, a social worker, supervises a child's welfare, and the parents must cooperate with social services. It's still quite intrusive though. A supervision order means that the supervising authority can require things like regular home visits, parents attending parenting courses, and the child attending medical appointments. And there is a lot of things in supervision orders where they'll come in and they'll check your cupboards and stuff to make sure what food you've got in it. It's not really a nice thing to happen, but it is a lot better than the interim order. At least now they can live in their own home. These orders usually last up to 12 months, but can be extended for another year if needed, with a maximum duration of 3 years. With this extra little bit of freedom, they turned up at a flat in North Wales with their first baby and a pram, stuffed with more than £10,000 in cash. Constance paid up front for the 2 flats, one for her and one for Mark across the road, and the landlady has since told the Sun they came from nowhere one day. She had a baby in the pram. The baby was covered in bags and bags and bags. They were hiding the baby. The landlady explained to them that babies were not allowed in the flats, but she bent the rules for them after Constance had insisted it was awfully good. I am sure it had nothing to do with the £10,000 they were stashing. The landlady went on to say Mark Gordon was very possessive and controlling of Constance. It was him who spoke all the time. I told her to go back to her family. I couldn't see why she was with him. He was so creepy, but she thought that Mark was the best thing. Constance told me that he was an honourable and good man, but she said he had his difficulties and had been abused as a child. He was very domineering. He was the boss. There was never a smile on him, never an honest smile. He had an angry smile. She also said that Mark never worked during the 6 months that he was in the flat, and Constance paid for everything. The couple apparently left in a rush in a van with 2 men who said they was going to Birmingham. The landlady also claimed that they'd left around £350 worth of damage caused by candles and joss sticks, adding, I think they were running away. Now, there is no record of Constance or Mark in Birmingham, but in September 2018, they moved into a house in Leigh Street in Ilford, East London, with no intervention from social services. Then, in October 2018, Constance books her second pregnancy directly with the community midwife. She does not share the details of the supervision order that's still in place or Mark's offending history. It's said that their first child at this point has got a bouncy castle in their bedroom, and Constance complained about having to find other ways to find money because she was getting less from the family trust. Again, at this point, neighbours are saying that they rarely left the house during daylight, and Mark installed CCTV cameras as soon as they arrived. One neighbour told The Sun, "Sometimes we saw them coming and going at night, but they were not very neighbourly. Social services came at times to knock, but they didn't open the door. They came again and again." Although there is a sense of some stability and normality about their lives at this time, it's also clear they were still trying to live a freer life away from aristocratic lifestyles. Constance's family and the control that she felt they inflicted upon them. It's alleged that they chose to rent a series of rundown properties rather than accept the offer from a trust fund to buy a house. A family source told the press, "Trustees tried to help her as much as they could, but she was a nightmare for them to deal with. Difficult, contrary, unpredictable, and entitled." This source claims that certain emails portraying to be from Constance requesting money were in their opinion written by Mark. Again, a former neighbour is saying that they don't appear to have any jobs, rarely went out, and sometimes had blazing rows. In January 2019, the supervision order from Wales finally expired. 3 months on, in April, Constance gave birth to her second child. But the independent midwife that they'd hired had safeguarding concerns and made a referral to Children's Social Care. A month on, in May, a Children and Families assessment is attempted, but Constance and Mark did not consent to the assessment, so I assume it just didn't take place. Now, other than that, as far as I can tell, up until this point, they were pretty much in the clear. They weren't off the social services radar. Once you've been on with social services, you're never really off the radar. But there were no orders in place, and they weren't this massive ton of pressure that they'd felt up until this point. Other than the concerns that had been reported by the midwife and the refusal of the assessment, in the last 16 months from the interim order, I can't see any other interventions in any other reports. But then towards the end of 2019, Constance was pregnant with their third child. This was where the 16 months of working forwards and everything being okay, everything fell to pieces once again. It was in November 2019 that Constance fell from a first story window. She was 14 weeks pregnant at that time. Apparently Mark didn't call for an ambulance, and it's widely reported that when the ambulance crew did arrive, he initially refused to let them in, so the police were called. Now, as you can expect, that throws them right back into the eye of social services. I mean, it's already in their files that they think he's controlling, abusive, and has a temper. And now he's acting strange and in a way hostile about the emergency services getting to Constance after she's had a fairly serious fall while pregnant. It was 4 a.m. when Constance finally arrived at the hospital via an ambulance. Despite Constance having suffered from a shattered spleen, her unborn baby was unarmed. She told police that she'd been trying to fix a TV aerial when she fell from the window, but her words weren't enough. The services believed she'd been pushed or caused to fall. With all this suspicion towards them, with all the questioning of Constance, it was bound to bring back the red flags, fearing that they would have their family constantly monitored, or even worse, taken away. The police wanted her to provide a statement, but she refused. In all, Constance spent 8 days in hospital, reportedly having attempted, with Mark's support, to discharge herself. But she weren't okay. She once again knew every parent's worst nightmare was her reality. The social services were on her case. She was in a heightened state of fear once again. She sought advice from Ian Joseph, who is an expert in evading social services. He advised her to flee to Ireland, and that's exactly what she did. Paranoid about the services and her family tracking her down. She used cash to rent a rural cottage near Dublin and allegedly even used a fake name. The grand plan was for Mark to join her later, but there was an issue. Because of his own circumstances, like being on the sexual offenders register and the incidents at the hospital during the first child's birth, Mark had his passport seized, so he couldn't make it to Ireland. Meanwhile, the social services and the courts were pursuing a suspected violent attack that had put her in hospital. A judge sitting in a family court later on concluded that Constance had been the victim of DV, despite Constance repeatedly denying it while she was in the country. But because of all this, the children were once again classed as a high risk. Her disappearing only made things worse. It allowed a wardship order to be placed with the High Courts. That effectively removes all parental responsibility from the parents and puts the children into the custody of the courts. However, how can that be enforced when Constance can't be notified? The children aren't in the country. Constance in the country. Nobody knows where she is. Things like wardship can only be enforced once a person is formally served. Now, Constance's eldest brother had previously been informed about the incident and he contacted his dad, who was in Australia. Napier became so concerned about Constance's welfare and the children's welfare, he hired a private investigator and ensured the court order letter was delivered. It's also worth noting, it's reported that Napier had previously offered to buy a house in Dorset and employ a nanny to look after the children until Constance could join them. It seems that Napier was basically offering a family placement of sorts. It seems he was trying to provide a middle ground where the children could stay with family or nannies rather than go into foster care. But from what we already know about Constance, it's only expected that she'd view that as her father trying to control her or steal her children, which is something she accuses the family of. You've got to remember that Constance's view is that Mark and their children are an embarrassment to the family and their name. This private investigator that her dad hired did eventually find Constance. They handed her the court's notice, and legally speaking from that moment on, she was on notice. She was legally required to return the children back to the jurisdiction of the English court. Reluctantly, Constance returned to England and reunited with Mark in January 2020. Their two children were taken under the powers of police protection. New interim care orders were granted for both the children, who were placed into foster care. A pre-assessment was also initiated for Constance's unborn child. Throughout this period, Constance and Mark were allowed regular supervised visits with their children. It's said that during these visits they'd bring music to play or arrive with presents. They would comfort the children if they were upset and sing and dance with them. Mark planted apple seeds in the contact centre's garden, one for each family member. I just want to add here that I can't show you the pictures because of reporting restrictions, and rightly so. I wouldn't want to in any way make it so people could identify these children. But there is pictures that Constance took from around 2020, and these children, or this child, is the most happy child I have ever seen in my life. It is absolutely adorable, with a smile that could melt stone. I am telling you, it is. But my biggest point here is how happy, healthy, and like I said, the size of that smile. Just such a happy child to be with its mother. It's absolutely heartbreaking and heartwarming and everything else. The pictures on their own are absolutely brilliant. I'm so gutted I can't show you. But even these visits would lead to greater distrust between the couple and the system. It's reported that their attendance became sporadic and they sometimes failed to show for the visits. But according to Support Not Separation, what's not so often reported is that in late 2020, Constance noted social workers were reporting visits inaccurately. She believed things weren't being noted, like one of her children were distressed and clung to her leg when it was time to leave. To help fight the care orders, Constance required that the contact visits should be happening in centres with CCTV, so she could prove the children were unhappy in the foster home and wanted to be reunited with the parents. But her request was denied. She was told that no centres with CCTV were available. So according to Constance and Mark, the reality is that's a big part of why they stopped visiting frequently. They were trying to get the visits in centres with CCTV to help their case. But as you've just seen, that is something else that would be held against them. Once again, a desperate attempt from Constance to try and prove that they deserve their children, and their children wanted to be with them, were turned around and used against them. And even social services would later note that when they did spend time with their children, the quality of contact on the whole is excellent, with abundant evidence of both parents' ability to create a warm, comfortable environment for their children. The pre-birth plan in respect to their third and unborn child was that on the day of birth, the child would be placed in Constance's custody in a residential assessment unit with Mark to join later. And I do want to point out here again that although all this fleeing made things a lot worse, this all came about because Mark had been blamed for Constance's fall despite her denying it. And regardless whether the DV, the DA were there, it's just sent to get a lot worse. There's no support throughout this story. It's all just cat and mouse chasing. Anyway, in 2020, in March specifically, 2 months after Constance returned to England, the first national lockdown came in the UK. As a result, contact with her children was stopped as the contact centres were closed. It was in May 2020 when she gave birth to her third child in hospital, and an emergency order was granted and then an interim care order. Apparently, they both refused placement into a residential unit, so the newborn was also taken into foster care, reportedly at 1 week old. The care proceedings were then consolidated with the other children's. Constance and Mark would never get their children back. In February 2021, a fact-finding hearing was held at the family court. The incident regarding Constance falling from the first-story window in November 2019 was classed as DA, or DV. The family court found the father has behaved violently towards the mother on at least one occasion, and that his conduct on that occasion, both in causing injury and in failing to seek medical help, put her life and the life of their unborn child at serious risk. I want to point out there, it's clear by that wording that at least once includes that one time. On the 5th of May 2021, midwives at Sydenham Green Health Centre, London, received a self-referral from Constance. She was then heavily pregnant. Appointments were arranged for her to see a midwife and then have urgent antenatal scans. But perhaps because they were back in the same untrusting headspace, Constance did not attend these appointments. Instead, she emailed the midwife to say that she had decided to have a private scan and would email the social services the result. The services then phoned her, in which she repeated that account. Constance never emailed the results from any scan. In mid-May 2021, a social worker conducted an unplanned home visit. It was Constance that answered the door, and she was heavily pregnant. She hid her body behind the door and were adamant that social services or the social worker were not going to enter her home. She told the social worker that she did not want social services to be draconian and take their baby away. She also refused to provide a mobile phone number, so the social worker gave Constance her mobile number and then left. 3 days later, she used that phone number and she phoned the social worker and stated that she'd obtained private healthcare for the pregnancy, but she wouldn't tell her where she'd got this private healthcare. Constance also said that she planned to have the baby in hospital and that there were no health concerns, so she didn't need to share any medical records. To counter that, in response, the social services said, look, we require that information in advance to ensure the safe delivery of the baby, and Constance just put the phone down. The fourth child was born in Lewisham Hospital in May 2021 at full term with no medical concerns. That same month, a social worker conducted a hospital visit with the both of them. Now, this visit was organised because they told the hospital that they were planning to leave the hospital and go to court for a hearing concerning their elder children. Constance was offered a video link to the court from the hospital, but she declined. So during this visit, the social worker explained that the baby wasn't ready to be discharged, and Constance should be looking after her baby and not leaving that to the nurses who had other duties. Now, I have to strongly interject here. I'm sorry, but I had a daughter pre-COVID. She had jaundice and she had to stay in hospital. Over the 2 or 3 weeks that my partner were in hospital, she was constantly told that she could go home, that she was encouraged to go home, have a bath, have a good night's sleep. And this is in despite of her having her own room, which was a decent size for her and the baby. She was allowed and encouraged to go for walks on her own, go and have vape breaks, go and get some fresh air, go and have a walk around the hospital grounds. She was allowed to leave for hours or even a night or two, and the ward staff would look after the baby. It was pretty much encouraged. She never did. I think she came home one night, and that one night I stayed at the hospital. But in contrast, my youngest daughter was born in 2021. Again, they had to stay in hospital for 3 weeks. But this time it was the complete opposite. She weren't even allowed to nip downstairs for a vape unless I were there. And I weren't allowed there. She weren't allowed to leave. The staff were very strict, authoritarian, and really quite cold. After a while, my partner were absolutely in bits. She was going out of her mind. She was constantly crying on the phone to me. She weren't allowed to leave this small room. She was so distressed. Like I said, just constantly on the phone crying to me. It was absolutely awful. But that's all that changed. The difference between them two and the difference in 2021, which we're talking about here, is the pandemic. But the point I want to make here is the staff weren't very nice to her. In our experience, they made out as if wanting to go downstairs for a bit of fresh air after being in a room for 3 weeks made you a bad parent. For just wanting 2 minutes of fresh air. So add my experience to what Constance was going through, and I think the reason I want to add that is because all the reports seem to try and make out it was unspeakable for Constance to leave the hospital for just a few hours to go to the court. And the sentences like the one I reported a minute ago, that she should be looking after her children and not leaving it to the nurses, is a horribly misleading statement that were purposely used to try and guilt trip her, and they've later been used to make her look bad. And like I said, the context is important here. She wasn't trying to leave to go to the pub. She was asking to leave her confinement so she could go to the court in regards to her other children. And Constance was defiant, as you'd expect. She was persistent in her intent to leave the hospital. So it was then explained to her that if she did so, it would be recorded in the social care record as abandoning the child. And if they left, they would not be able to return to the ward because of the COVID restrictions. Which again is unfair because most hospitals just use the PCR test policy. But regardless, Constance had got it into her head that she was going, so she did. Her and Martin, she left the hospital without the baby. Constance then attempted to return to the ward the next day and became very upset when they refused her entry, which again is completely understandable. And there were a lot of court things at this time of people not being allowed with children and stuff because of the restrictions. Like I say, it was a very cold time. Now, I don't want to get a debate about the concerns, but everything felt very cold at that time. It said that Constance refused a PCR test, in which she'd later tell social services that her and Mark were naturalists and didn't agree with any medical intervention with their child. An interim care order was granted in regards to the baby, and they was discharged into foster care. And then again, their case was consolidated with their siblings' care proceedings. It might be worth noting that prior to this birth and the midwifery notification, Constance and Mark had relocated to another location in London. As a result, it was a different council dealing with them, a different authority. During September and October 2021, Constance's mom hired yet again another agent. Blackstone Consultancy is a high-end private investigation firm specialising to track a couple and assess their living conditions. In January 2022, a family court judge decided that although there was vivid snapshots of what could, if this were the complete picture, be a loving and integrated family, all 4 children, all aged under 5, should be permanently removed. At this point, Constance desperately pled with the courts. She offered to separate from Mark in order to get custody of her children back. But the judge simply didn't believe that she'd honour that. He didn't believe that she'd separate from Mark. It was on the 28th of January 2022 that care and placement orders were made in respect to all 4 children. The children were now permanently placed with foster parents. The family court judge described the nature of the relationship between Constance and Mark as being obscure, and one that involved serious physical violence perpetrated by Mark onto Constance, that gives an obvious and significant risk to a newborn being caught up in a similar incident. In family court in February 2021, a judge had ruled the pair put the relationship ahead of all other considerations and viewed all offers of support as hostile. In these final hearings in 2022, the judge said, "The strong impression given by the parents is that the 2 people who are fiercely united in an unrelenting struggle against a non-existent opponent." Interestingly, it's also reported in 2022 Virginia tried to put herself forward as a potential carer for the children. She told the family court she felt desperately sad for her daughter and the children, but she later withdrew her offer after being given full access to her daughter's files. Her lawyer is quoted saying she saw the relationship between the parents as an enmeshed and abusive one, and was concerned that if any of the children were placed with her, she would not be able to safely care for them. As you can imagine, the final decision to put all 4 children into foster care was devastating. Losing a child to the care system is one of the most traumatic experiences a parent could face. But losing all 4 children in succession and then at the same time created a deep and lasting conflict between Constance, Mark and the authorities responsible for child protection. It was the final straw for Constance and Mark. Their constant attempts of trying to get around the system that seemed to always attack them had failed. It was time to completely omit the system. Within weeks of that order being made, Constance Marten was pregnant again with baby Victoria. But this time was different. This time, her and Mark were determined they was going to keep Victoria at all costs. They were convinced that social services would intervene immediately after the birth, probably even before the birth. I mean, why wouldn't they? They have pretty much every other time. And so it was Constance and Mark began to consider a desperate plan. They'd keep the pregnancy completely secret, and instead of cooperating with any authorities at all, they would disappear completely. They would go somewhere that nobody would find them, and they would keep their child alone, together, outside of the system. But their decision to run would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to tragedy. Because when Constance Marten gave birth to her 5th child, a baby girl named Victoria, the couple were already living life on the run, moving from place to place, avoiding the authorities, always trying to stay hidden, using the same methods as always: cash, fake names, no cameras. What they didn't realise is their plan that they believed would protect their child would ultimately place her in mortal danger. In the weeks before Victoria's birth, Constance and Mark had quietly began taking the steps to avoid detection. One of the first things they were doing was withdrawing large amounts of cash. Evidence shows that in the 4 months between the 1st of September 2022 and the 3rd of January 2023, payments totaling £47,886 were made to Constance's bank account. That is made up of a monthly allowance that had increased from just £500 a month to £3,400 a month, as well as larger payments, including a £13,596 to be for the purchase of a camera and filming equipment on the 17th of November 2022, then £15,590 for the purchase of a car on the 22nd of December 2022. Using cash meant that they'd be able to avoid leaving a digital trail, which is a track that police, authorities, and other private investigators that somebody might hire could easily track. At some point in late 2022 or early January 2023, Constance Marten gave birth to the couple's 5th child, Victoria. Unlike Constance's other births, this time there was no doctors present, no midwives, no hospital. In fact, nobody even knew about this pregnancy. Nobody apart from Constance and Mark. Exactly when this birth took place has never even been fully established. As you'll hear through this part, that Constance does state when and where this baby was born, but the prosecution will later strongly disagree with that. Soon after the birth, the couple began moving across the country. They were travelling by car and trying to stay hidden, trying to avoid the authorities that they believed would take away their baby. But it wouldn't be long before something happened that would expose their disappearance to the entire country. On the 19th of December 2022, Mark Gordon attended a police station in Sheffield. He was there to report in as part of his requirements for being on the sex offenders register. He told the police that he was homeless and he had no fixed abode. The next day, the 20th of December 2022, Constance and Mark booked into a holiday cottage in Northumberland, with the rental due to end on Boxing Day. And this is when Constance and Mark claim that this baby, Victoria, was born on Christmas Eve 2022. She even states that it was on the bed. However, despite the bed sheets being found in the washing machine in the cottage, the prosecution would later disagree with this, and we'll explain why later. On Boxing Day, Mark again attended a police station and informed them that he was homeless. But this was the last time Mark Gordon would report his whereabouts to the police. After their departure from this cottage, the cottage stayed empty for 2 days. When the owner attended on the 28th of December, he's found what he reported as the cottage was in something of a state. It was also on the 28th of December that their Suzuki car broke down on the M18. The recovery driver that went to their rescue doesn't recall any signs of a baby, but he does recall that the back and the side windows of the car had been blacked out by clothing. The impression that he got was that they'd been living in the car. But on they went, they loaded up the vehicle onto the truck and left the motorway. The original destination had been Leeds University, but as they set off, Mark asked to go to Frome, specifically an address of 90 King Street. And I'm not entirely sure what happened when they got there, but this recovery driver took them in the car to this address, and there was something of a disagreement. He then took them to a nearby Sainsbury's, which would pretty much end at King Street, and he left them there. Now, King Street is just 1 mile away from the M18 junction, so it's either a 1 mile journey or a bit longer that they was with this recovery driver. Either which way, in all that time, the recovery driver did not see, hear, or even hear the mention of or any reference to any baby. As far as he was aware, there was no baby there. Exactly a week later on from that, on the 4th of January 2023, they checked into the Ibis Hotel at the Limb Services in Cheshire. That's about 85 miles away. Then later they went to the AC Hotel in Manchester, which is another 20 miles. So already you can see they are making this pattern of constantly moving, and not just like village to village, they're making big distances. But it'd be the next day that that'd come to a stop once again. It was the next day that everything went wrong. On the evening of 5th of January 2023, motorists travelling along the A61 near Bolton in Greater Manchester began noticing something unusual ahead. A car had stopped on the hard shoulder.
Where to, mate?
The nearest rest stop. I didn't do you mean the services? Yeah, of course. Well, it's not, it's quite a while, it's quite a far distance, No, I'm not bothered about that. Just trying to think where you're better off.
Smoke was pouring from the vehicle. Within moments, flames began to spread. The firefighters and the police arrived at 33 minutes past 6 that evening, and when they had, the situation was already very serious. The car was engulfed in flames. And of course, fire crews did what they do, and they quickly worked to get the flames under control. But something about the scene struck with investigators as a bit strange. There was no one inside the car, there was no one near the car. It had been completely abandoned. Now, I suppose that's not an absolute unknown, but what made it even stranger was there was belongings, clothing and other items down the side of the car and scattered up the bank of the motorway. Whoever had been driving this vehicle had abandoned it in a rush before the emergency services arrived. So once the fire had been extinguished, the examination of the car began. Inside the wreckage, they discovered items that immediately raised alarms. Among the debris were baby supplies. The items in and around the car included a baby seat, nappies, pacifiers, Sudocrem, baby wipes, and even baby clothes and blankets. And if the police weren't yet convinced that this car was in some way connected to a baby, all doubts were erased when they found some human tissue in the back. The tissue would turn out to be a placenta. They also found a passport, other personal belongings, £2,000 in cash, and more than 30 mobile phones. Most sources that are reliable say 34. Now, although these burner phones show somebody that's got a massive paranoia, it was a passport that was the biggest clue, because despite this raging fire, the passport was still pretty much intact, and it belonged to Constance Marten. It's also noted there was blood on the back seat of the car, and this car had been bought after Christmas Eve, which is one of the main reasons the prosecution dispute the baby's birth, regarding the date and the place. The preliminary investigation into the fire and the surrounding events uncovered that Constance was believed to have given birth roughly 2 days earlier and was not seen by any medics. FYI, 2 days earlier would have been the 3rd of January, a good week off from Christmas Eve. So again, at this point, there's a national alert triggered, because Constance had not only concealed the pregnancy, but she's also now hiding a baby. So to the system, this is a major concern. Even more so when we click on that she's had children removed, and then all the domestic stuff behind that as well. So it goes without saying that in the authorities' eyes, they needed to be found for Constance's sake and for the baby's as quick as possible. Police frantically investigated who might have been travelling in that car, and of course the evidence suggested she was most likely accompanied by Mark Gordon. And of course at first officers were completely unsure what had happened. Had they simply fled the car after it caught fire, which is what happens sometimes? Or had they been involved in an accident? Or was there something much darker and much more sinister going on? As investigators dug into their backgrounds, the situation became far more concerning. And obviously it was only a matter of time before the authorities realised that Constance and Mark weren't the ordinary missing motorists. And luck really weren't on Mark and Constance's side. Having one car break down and the other one set on fire just days after left them without a car. So now they haven't got any fixed abode, they haven't got a car, so there's pretty much no shelter, and this is in Britain's coldest time of year. They've also got no medical care, they've got no warmth, and it's extremely likely they've got a newborn baby with them. And without the right shelter and the right care and the right medical equipment, a baby in January in the UK, sleeping rough, is extremely vulnerable. So it didn't take the police long to figure out that this is a very critical situation and time is of the essence. So police began searching nearby areas. Officers checked CCTV cameras along the motorway and the surrounding roads. It didn't take them too long to discover footage showing Constance and Mark leaving the scene. They'd taken whatever belongings they could carry and walked away from the burning car. Crucially, the footage seemed to confirm what they were all fearing. It showed Constance Marten carrying what looked like a newborn baby in a blanket. They'd walked along the M61 motorway to Anchor Lane Bridge that goes over the motorway. From there, they hitched a ride and was taken to a Morrison's store in Bolton by a member of the public. They were then seen on CCTV at Bolton train station, apparently wearing clothes that were clearly soaking wet. At this stage, other than what they're wearing, they had little, if any, belongings for themselves, let alone the newborn baby Victoria. They'd lost pretty much everything they'd brought with them in preparation in this fire. From Bolton, they then went to Liverpool, apparently by taxi, and that's about 37 miles. After a short time in Liverpool, they then spent £350 to £400 on a taxi to Harwich in Essex. That was in the early hours of the morning, and that's about a 275-mile journey. Over about 18 hours after the burnt car was found, Greater Manchester Police released a public appeal at 10 to 1 in the afternoon to try and find Constance and Mark. This appeal featured pictures of them and a direct plea for Constance from the head of public protection. In this appeal, she said, "As a mom, I would like to make a direct appeal to Constance. Constance, I know this is an exceptionally hard time for you, and you are likely feeling scared, but I promise that our number one priority is the same as yours, to keep your beautiful newborn safe. As you know, it is really important that both you and your baby are assessed by medical professionals as soon as possible. So please make contact with emergency services or make your way to your nearest hospital, wherever that may be." They were in and around Harwich that day and in the port area on the 7th of January. CCTV footage from the port shows Constance wrapped in a large red scarf outside the port at around 9 a.m. in the morning. While in Harwich, they stayed in a Premier Inn hotel under a false name. It was while they was hanging around the ports that a member of public spotted them and asked them if they were the people who had been on the news. Of course, they denied that. It's interesting to know at this point they are 200 miles away from where the car set on fire. As the hunt for Constance and Mark entered its third day, Essex Police started liaising with the officers in Greater Manchester. On the day, a spokeswoman said, "Since 9:30 a.m, we've been carrying out extensive inquiries in Essex to locate Constance, Mark, and their newborn child. Greater Manchester Police is the lead force, and we will do all we can to help." Later that morning, Constance and Mark then took another taxi to Colchester. That's another 20 miles. Then they moved to East Ham, which is in London, and that was another 60 miles. While in East Ham, Mark went to buy a kebab. He then went to an Argos at 19 minutes past 6 in the evening. He bought a pushchair, a blue tent and some sleeping bags, as well as some pillows and some other items. Mark went inside alone and he paid in cash. He walked out alone after 11 minutes, and then they spent the next 3 hours or more walking around Whitechapel Road area before going to Boots to buy another dummy. Constance would later claim that the baby was frequently wearing a ski jacket and was normally carried in a sling, but the judge would later point out that around this time the baby was seen briefly and she was only wearing a baby grow and she weren't in a sling, which I don't think is very fair because they didn't have the buggy for long, so it is likely that the rest of the time she was in some form of sling. Either which way, Constance and Mark tried to flag down 3 black cabs, but they were refused. The pair then left the area on foot and were last seen walking along Brick Lane towards Bethnal Green Road at 10 p.m. Police around this time are saying that Mark's quite often seen walking alone ahead of Constance and the baby. They dined in Whitechapel, then abandoned the buggy and got another taxi from Allison Road in Haringey to the south coast. The taxi driver was told to head for Portsmouth, but it weren't long before he was asked to divert course to Newhaven, in particular the ferry port. That's in East Sussex. And again, that's 85 miles away. So now they've travelled that far across the country, they've literally gone from the northwest all the way down to the south. They were dropped off outside the entrance of the port at 4 minutes to 5 in the morning on the 8th of January 2023. They were caught on CCTV heading towards open fields on Cantercrow Hill. It's thought from this period on they stayed in a tent. By the 9th of January, in real time, the only recent sighting of Constance and Mark were confined to the Essex area, and the British Transport Police were now joining the investigation, trying to figure out where they might have gone. Every hotel in the area were contacted by Essex Police, who took over leading the investigation. 2 days on the 11th of January, Essex Police were continuing its searches across Essex with no further sightings since the 9th of January. Leaflets were being distributed to members of the public, and of course these leaflets had Constance and Mark's faces on them. With 3 days unaccounted for, the next sighting was on the 12th of January, when they went to a Texaco petrol station, and while they were there they purchased various items, including some petrol, which Constance had put into a glass bottle. The next day, the 13th of January, the Metropolitan Police joined the investigation after CCTV was found showing them outside East Ham Station in East London. It was also on this date that another appeal was issued, urging the couple to come forward with their baby so it could be checked over. Another 3 days on, the 16th of January, there were now sightings in Stanmer Park in Brighton. Another 3 days on, the 17th of January, Tensions were really high, the pressure was mounting. It's now the 19th of January, and Constance's dad Napier issued a plea for Constance to get herself and the baby to safety. Interestingly, the plea wasn't put out by the police, but instead published by The Independent. Here is the plea.
My name is Napier Marten. I am grateful for this opportunity to appeal directly to my daughter Constance, following the public revelations concerning her partner Mark Gordon, and having lived with the family in great concern, knowing of his past record for some time. Darling Constance, even though we remain estranged at the moment, I stand by, as I have always done and as the family has always done, to do whatever is necessary for your safe return to us. I beseech you to find a way to turn yourself and your wee one into the police as soon as possible, so you and he or she can be protected. Only then can a process of healing and recovery begin, however long it may take, however difficult it may be. I would like you to understand that the family will do all that is needed for your well-being, and I also wish you to understand you are much, much loved, whatever the circumstances. We are deeply concerned for your and your baby's welfare. The past 8 years have been beyond painful for all the family, as well as your friends, as they must have been for you. And to see you so vulnerable again is testing in the extreme. I would like to extend my gratitude to the police for all their endeavours in bringing this tragic episode to a swift and safe conclusion, and appeal to you, please, Constance, find the courage to present yourself to the police as soon as possible. Thank you.
Another 5 days on, the 24th of January, the Metropolitan Police stated that the missing trio might be sleeping in a tent bought from Argos in sub-zero temperatures to evade the authorities. Bearing in mind that intel came out over 2 weeks after they purchased the tent. A week on, we're now the 31st of January. A £10,000 reward to find them was offered by the police. The police also added that the pushchair had been dumped 3 weeks prior. But there had been some leeway. The detectives working to try and trace them had now tracked them to New Haven in East Sussex. Another 5 days on, the 5th of February. Police were still believing that Constance and Mark were camping outside, somewhere in the Sussex countryside, with their newborn. 2 days later, on the 7th of February, Constance's mom issued an emotional open letter in which she pledged to stand by Constance and the grandchild. Open letter to my darling daughter Constance. You have made choices in your personal adult life which have proven to be challenging. However, I respect them. I know that you want to keep your precious newborn child at all costs. With all that you have gone through, this baby cannot be removed from you, but instead needs looking after in a kind and warm environment. I want to help you and my grandchild. You deserve the opportunity to build a new life, establish a stable family, and enjoy the same freedoms that most of us have. Constance, I will do what I can to stand alongside you and my grandchild. You are not alone in this situation. We will support you in whatever way we can. I am ready to do what it takes for you to recover from this awful experience so you can thrive and enjoy motherhood. I love you and miss you. Mom. Kiss, kiss. On the 16th, 17th of February, they was apparently seen pushing a buggy and looking dishevelled. Later that day, the tent was seen set up on Caldine Lane in Brighton. On the 19th of February, they were seen on Stanmore Park Nature Reserve near Brighton. Now keep this in mind because when we get to the court section, there is a witness that talks about seeing them, and the main takeaway from that witness statement is they believed at this point Victoria was no longer alive. It's now the 21st of February, and in real time, the family hadn't been seen since the 8th of January. A month and a half had passed, and police were now saying they could be anywhere in the UK. So now the director of midwifery For Bart's Health NHS Trust made a direct appeal for Constance to come forward. Constance, my name is Sharon, and I'm here to speak to you as a midwife and a mother. I am not here to judge you, but here to help you and your baby. I know that you really love your baby, and I know what an exciting and worrying time being a mom can be. And I want to make sure that you and your baby are okay and get the care you need. After you have a baby, midwives are there to check you are recovering physically and emotionally and adjusting to caring for your newborn. We check your baby is feeding properly and putting on weight, and they have screening tests to make sure their heart, hearing, hips and eyesight are all okay. We also check for some rare conditions and put care plans in place to support them if needed. Staggeringly, it wasn't for almost another week, almost 2 months since their last sighting, that they were spotted again. Although it is said there were potential sightings on Hollingbury Golf Course in Brighton. Their next official reported sighting was on the 27th of February. It was a visit to Mulberry's convenience store in Hollingbury Place in Brighton to buy some food that led to their arrest. It was a member of public that had seen them withdrawing cash. They recognised them from the news and then called 999. That call landed just before 9:30. The police were quick to it. They arrived on scene within just 6 minutes. They very quickly spotted Constance and Mark walking through the city. Within minutes of this initial sighting, the couple were under arrest at 25 to 10 that night. They was under arrest for suspicion of child neglect.
Hello, sorry mate. You just stop for a second. Stop for it. Well, I need to speak to you. Well, because potentially I think you may have been in national news. Right, you're running away from me. So, put the stick down. Drop it now.
What?
Put the stick down and I'll explain.
Alright.
Put the stick, let go of the stick. The stick in your hand.
Alright.
Let go of the stick.
Alright.
Let go of the stick.
Why?
Because at the moment I'm potentially going to be a weapon. And if you're who I believe you might be, you might have quite a good reason to get away from me.
Put it down.
What?
Put the stick down. Oh, look at the photo on that.
Oh, where's the child, madam?
Where is the child, please?
Daddy bear.
Look at me.
Constance.
Constance, Arabella, whoever you are.
Right, where's your child? Have we searched her?
The sooner you tell
Yeah,
us.
this isn't at the front, is it? I've just asked. I'm going to undo it now. I've just.
I'll level
Why
with
are we
you.
under arrest?
You're under arrest for child neglect.
We're doing what?
Where is the child?
Constance, at the moment you're under arrest for child neglect. It's 21:45 and you are further under arrest for concealment of the birth of a child on the 4th of the 1st, 2023.
Arrested for concealment?
Just listen to the last offence.
You are under arrest for concealment of the birth of a child.
How's that? That's not arrest.
Right. And section 20, section 27, Offence Against the Person Act, expose a child under the age of 2 years, whereas by life or health to be endangered. Do you understand what you've been arrested for?
The last time, not the first two.
Right.
You can't arrest someone for hiding a pregnancy.
Right, okay, well that's
not arrested offence.
okay, they are the offences that I've arrested you on suspicion of. The necessity of your arrest is protect from person and prevent disappearance. Do you understand that you've been arrested? Section 27 Offence Against the Person Act, expose a child under the age of 2 years, whereas life or health is to be endangered. Do you understand? Do you understand what I've said to you? Do you understand what I've said to you? You've been further arrested for 3 more offences. What are the offences? Concealment of the birth, expose a child under the age of 2 that's likely to endanger their life or their health. Okay? The necessity for those arrests is to protect a vulnerable person, I believe the child, and to prevent your disappearance. Okay? Where's your child, my friend? Where's the child?
And my food, please.
In a minute, where's your child?
Yes, and food.
Where's your child?
Food?
In a minute. Where's your child? Where's your child?
And my food, please.
In a minute, where's your child?
My food.
Not on the
What are you
moment.
grabbing me for?
Where's your
Is
child?
that aggression necessary?
He's not being aggressive.
Of course you are. I'm not doing anything that's family.
Where's the child?
I want food.
We want to know where the child is.
Have my food.
Is the child alive?
I want food, please.
Is your child alive? Where's the child?
Food?
Where's the child?
Food, please.
I'm not going to make you a sandwich. We need to work out where your child is, mate.
I got food to eat.
Yeah, we got a child to find.
Okay.
It's a bit more important. We want to know where this child is. We need to know. It's important.
My food is important.
Where is the child?
When was the last time you saw the child?
Food, drink, please.
Do you still have your child?
What's the deal about getting my food?
It's reported both defendants smelt very unpleasant, as if they had not washed in several weeks. Constance was wearing several layers of clothing, and placed between those layers was what appeared to be furniture stuffing, which must have been removed at some point on some scavenger hunt for items. It's also said Mark was wearing a Christmas jumper with paper in the lining of his jacket for extra warmth. A quote I've got from the court says, "It is worth noting at this stage that Mark would later require the use of a wheelchair, claiming his legs were in pain and his hands were swollen." For over the last 2 months, Constance and Mark had stayed mobile, avoiding staying in one place for too long in order not to be detected. Television news, newspapers and online outlets all carried the same message. Police are searching for a couple believing to be travelling with a very young baby. Officers urge the public to report any sightings immediately. Behind the scenes, investigators worked around the clock. Each new piece of CCTV footage helped build a clearer picture of the couple's movements. And each time they appeared on camera, the same pattern emerged. They were travelling light, eventually avoiding hotels and other official accommodation, moving through busy areas where they could blend into crowds. For 2 months, they'd managed to stay one step ahead of the search. They moved across different parts of England, appearing on cameras only briefly before disappearing again. Police repeatedly appealed for any information, and members of the public were reporting possible sightings. Apparently every single lead was followed, every single tip investigated. But Constance and Mark still managed to evade capture until the 27th of February after 54 days, and it all came to an end. Or at least that's what the police were hoping for. But there was an issue that was the same question as all along. Where is the baby? On the scene in the streets of Brighton, Constance and Mark were asked where the baby was, and they constantly refused to say. At this point, the baby hadn't been seen by CCTV or witnesses for weeks. For investigators, this situation was absolutely terrifying. If the baby had been left somewhere, and the baby was alone, time was running out. A newborn infant abandoned outdoor in February's wintry conditions, apparently the coldest month of the year in the UK, they could only survive for hours. So police began urgent searches in that surrounding area. Huge numbers of officers were deployed across Brighton. Many sources claim there were either 100 or 200 police involved in this search. 200 is the most commonly used number. Search teams combed through parks, alleyways, empty lots, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, all across Brighton. Every possible location wherein baby might have been left was examined. The effort became a massive operation. Specialist search teams joined the investigation. Officers worked day and night, hoping they might still find Victoria alive. Once arrested, Constance and Mark underwent medical checks in custody and remained in custody while this huge manhunt swept through Brighton. Investigators continued to question them about the baby, but according to police accounts, neither of them would cooperate. They just outright refused any cooperation. They wouldn't reveal where Victoria had been taken or anything else. They just wouldn't speak about Victoria. Days passed and this search was still continuing. The longer it went on, the more investigators feared for the worst. Eventually, 2 days after their arrest, on the 1st of March, the search was over. During searches in Brighton, officers located a shed in a community garden allotment area. Inside, they found a shopping bag, and inside that bag was Victoria's body. She'd been dead for some time. Up until this point, Constance had refused to talk to the police about Victoria, where she was, if she was alive, nothing. But this was the moment that it all changed. Here's the footage of Constance being told Victoria's body had been found.
What we're going to talk about this evening, we're going to talk about a baby that's been found. We have found a baby. And Constance, I can tell you, the baby's not alive. Go on.
Do you have a question or?
Is it your baby?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Okay. So just to clarify, you just told me the baby that we found this evening
Yeah,
is your baby.
yeah.
Right. Tell me about her, Constance. Take your time. Constance. There is no rush, Constance. I can see it's very, very distressing for you. And you're physically upset now. Alright? Please, I really want you to take your time. There is no rush. No rush whatsoever.
Yeah.
Alright? Like I said, and I promised you this yesterday, I'm not here to judge in this interview. Alright? This is your interview, and this is your opportunity to tell me what's happened.
Constance now had nothing left to lose, so it was now that Constance started to open up and talk about what happened. She claimed that she'd woke up to found Victoria dead in a jacket while they were staying in the countryside. When I woke up, I was crouched over her like that, holding her, and she weren't moving when I woke up. I didn't know how long I'd been asleep. I saw she weren't moving and her lips had gone blue. And yet, I don't know how long we slept. I know why she make any noise, and I was just so tired. I don't know. Yeah, that's all I can say. I tried to resuscitate her, I tried to breathe in her mouth and pump her chest, and there was no response. So I wrapped her in a scarf and cradled her for a few minutes. I didn't know what to do. Now, remember when she bought petrol in the glass bottle? Did you not think that was strange because we didn't have a car? Well, Constance said that she bought that petrol because she'd considered cremating Victoria, and that she'd kept the body because she wanted Victoria to have a proper burial, but she didn't know what to do. I don't know if you found, there's a bottle of petroleum in a bag, because I debated whether to cremate her myself, get rid of the evidence, but I decided to keep her because I knew at some point in the future I was going to be asked about it, but I just didn't know what to do. I kept the body because I wanted an autopsy done. I didn't bury her because I wanted her to have a proper burial. So I've been carrying her around, not knowing what to do really. I didn't want to bury her in a forest, some random place, because I wanted to have a proper burial, but also because I was concerned an animal might eat her, and that would affect the autopsy. She also told the police that the baby had died in Harwich. I fell asleep holding her sitting up, and when I woke up, she wasn't alive. When I woke up, she wasn't alive in my jacket. I believe I fell asleep on top of her, but I literally didn't. She didn't make any crying or movement, and when I woke up, she wasn't alive. Then I was holding her in my jacket. That's how I usually held her, but I think I fell asleep, crouching over her, and she passed away. Constance also told the police, I decided not to hand myself in. I made a decision that I wasn't going to do it. So basically to hide the body somewhere and then come back at a later date to try and get a proper burial. Or something. My thoughts. Yeah. Asked why she opted against going to the authorities, she said, because I'm all over the media and I didn't want to hand myself in. It's too much. It's a prison charge, isn't it? I don't think I wanted to go to prison. Regarding how Victoria's life started, I was feeling fine. I was elated to be with her, actually. To be with one of my children, with Mark, together, and parenting. She also said her and Mark found themselves between a rock and a hard place. We had limited cash. I knew I couldn't access the bank because then the police would know where I was. We were trying to figure out what to do in terms of getting a house, accessing money without the authorities finding out where we were. Much later she does detail their initial plans, that they had, which included getting accommodation, but she got spooked when they got recognised by that member of the public in the port. She also talks of wanting to go abroad to get away from the authorities in the UK. But obviously all these plans were made really hard by this national manhunt. So Constance is pretty much saying that she isn't entirely sure what had happened, but she can only surmise that the death was caused by what's called overlaying, which we talked about earlier in this documentary. And in all honesty, I think that is a plausible explanation. She's been warned multiple times about sleeping with her babies, and it's widely known, I said it earlier, that the chances of overlaying are massively increased when the mother's been drinking or they're overly tired. And with all considered, it's very reasonable to assume Constance was overly tired. Since giving birth, she has been on the run and sleeping rough. But it was cold outside, so it was also important to keep Victoria close to her to share body warmth and keep Victoria warm. But that explanation didn't quite suit the prosecution's view. They already had the full intention of trying Constance for concealing Victoria's pregnancy and Victoria's birth. Then for neglect and child abuse for having Victoria live in them conditions. So the prosecution weren't willing to believe Victoria died from overlaying. They believed Victoria died from hypothermia. They believed it wasn't an accident. It was a result of gross negligence. At the police station, Mark was asked where the baby was, but he refused to answer and he demanded food. He was given crisps, which he ate from a bag on the floor. He was given a sandwich and a drink. He was asked again where the baby was, but he asked for sweets. He was given sweets and asked for chocolate. In the shed where Victoria was found, the tent was also found. Victoria's body was transported for a post-mortem examination. Forensic specialists began examining the remains to determine the cause of death. But from the very beginning, the investigation faced a significant challenge because of the time that had passed between Victoria's death and the discovery of the body. So forensic experts found it difficult to determine the exact cause of death. Decomposition had made it impossible to identify one single definitive cause. What came next would be one of the most disturbing criminal trials in recent British history. As with everything in this case, this trial wasn't straightforward. In fact, it was far from it. Constance Marten and Mark Gordon had been charged with manslaughter by gross negligence, causing or allowing the death of a child, concealing the birth of a child cruelty, and perverting the course of justice. They denied all charges, so the trial officially began on the 25th of January 2024 at the Old Bailey in London. It was originally scheduled to last just 6 weeks, but it was plagued by delays, including health issues for Constance, a fire at the Old Bailey, and the Easter holidays. At one point before the start of her own evidence, Constance caused days of delays through complaints about toothache. It was widely suspected that it were a fake. She was fine. But eventually the judge made the special arrangements for a prison dentist to see her, and it turned out that these pain complaints were real and serious. Root canal surgery was a possibility, but Constance, being defiant as ever, refused to be treated. In all, this trial ended up being just shy of 5 months long. At the end of it all, on the 19th of June 2024, the jury of 5 men and 5 women had spent 72 hours and 33 minutes deliberating before they were discharged, because they were unable to reach a verdict in regards to the manslaughter charge. Now, when this happens, there is a court hearing in which the prosecution states if it's going for a retrial or if it's going to submit a noli prosequi, which basically means that they drop the charges without a verdict. However, if that was to happen, Constance and Mark wouldn't walk free, because the previous jury, the jury that had just been discharged, had found them guilty of the other counts, i.e. concealing the birth of a child and perverting the course of justice. In this case, it was obvious the prosecution was going to go for a retrial, and that started 9 months later on the 10th of March 2025. So the information that follows hasn't been separated between the trials. We'd be here all day. Instead, it's been constructed in a way that gives you as much information as possible about what was said from everybody overall. Because of that, there is times where I seem to repeat information, but I've kept it in because it seems to vary in one way or another and it could carry a different meaning. Constance told the court that she had a bad experience with the birth of her first child in the NHS and felt that she'd made a bet with the devil in her dealings with the social services. She told the jury she had become distrustful after she was advised against giving birth to a second child at home because the baby was huge. She said, "I panicked and got a private scan. They said there was nothing wrong. Of course you can have a home birth." She claimed to have researched hypnobirthing, but added, "I do think that you should have scans to check that the baby is in the right position, and baby is okay. But I don't think midwifery is necessary. Once you have had your first child, a woman is quite initiative." Constance also told jurors that in December 2022, she had been moving around the country to avoid social services taking her unborn baby Victoria away from her. "I wanted to keep Victoria with us, so I did not want to tell anyone about the birth. I was in good health physically, but I was in a high state of fear. I thought someone was going to bash down the door and take her away. I was joyful, but at the same time, anxious." Constance told the first jury that her and Mark were moving every 1 to 3 days while she was pregnant with Victoria, so she would not be taken. "I wanted Victoria with me for the first 3 to 6 months of her life, so I could give her the love that she needs, because I don't think it's fair for any children to be removed from their parents. A mother's love for her child is incredibly strong." At the retrial, she explained that they moved between places because I didn't want one single authority to have a jurisdiction over my daughter. So if we kept moving, they couldn't take her. She said that the car had exploded when they were driving and that she had the placenta with her because she intended on burying it as a religious thing because you can bury it and grow a tree from it. It's just something we do. She said she believed they were being pursued by private investigators who tampered with their vehicles and installed GPS trackers in what she called a cat and mouse game, going on to state that she found one of these tracking devices on one of their cars. "The only reason we ended up in Wales was because of a person who I am convinced was behind the explosion of the car. There's a few people in my biological family who see me as an embarrassment and are scared I will speak out about them and will stop at nothing to get what they want. Some people who are privileged think they are above the rules. It is harrowing. You are up against these people who will stop at nothing, who have endless resources and connections, and I don't think I can get away from them. The problem I had was I was not just up against social services, but family members who were very influential with huge connections in high places, including Parliament. If they said to social services jump, social services will say how high. They are highly embarrassed about the fact I had children with Mark, and the fact they do not come from an upper class, privileged background." When asked if Constance would describe her background as privileged, she said, "Financially, yes. Emotionally, not at all." She said that she tried to introduce Mark to members of her family, but she found them to be very cold towards him. "I have always had a frosty relationship with my family. They can be quite bigoted. I don't really want to be a part of it. I didn't really grow up with them. I went to boarding school when I was about 8. She said her family would try to get my children taken off me and refused to take them in when they were put up for adoption. She claimed she was cut off overnight while heavily pregnant with her first child and fled to Wales. I had to escape my family because my family are extremely oppressive and bigoted and wouldn't allow me to have my children with my husband. They would do anything to erase that child from the family line, which is what they ended up doing." She also said, "My family have a lot of money, a lot of clout, and a lot of connections. That's how they are able to do what they did." Referring to previous court proceedings, she said, "They said I was bearing children to sell on the black market, but I was a drug addict. Allegations that were wholly unfounded." She said her family trust had also told her that if you still have that black boyfriend with you, you are never going to get a property. She went on that her and Mark received a huge amount of prejudice from people, especially from my family. While pregnant with Victoria, on Christmas Eve, they went shopping for baby equipment at Primark in Carlisle. It was there that she started to feel that the baby was coming. "I started having birth pangs pretty much as we were leaving Carlisle." She went on to say that she drove back to the cottage and she said she gave birth leaning against the bed upstairs without medical assistance. "It was a very quick birth actually, very easy. Obviously, it would have been nicer to have been somewhere stable and to have been able to properly relax, but we weren't in that position." A barrister asked if she was thinking clearly at that time, We were in a set of circumstances that we couldn't have planned for. Our clarity came from a place of love and wanting to stay with our daughter. Asked if she would do the same thing if it happened all over again, she said, "If I had a crystal ball and could see into the future, what could happen to Victoria because of my exhaustion, of course I would have preferred to have made different choices. But we did what we could in the moment to keep her with her parents and protect her." Constance initially said that Victoria had died 3 days after the car had exploded. She then corrected herself to say 5 or 7 days. I just woke up and felt something was wrong. I think Mark woke up at the same time. I just took her out my jacket and she was completely limp. She was pale and her lips were kind of a purpley colour. I just knew she wasn't alive and I felt very responsible. My assumption was that I had fallen asleep on her. It was at first disbelief, not wanting to think that she wasn't alive. I just knew she wasn't alive. But Mark wouldn't believe it and he tried to do CPR on her. There was a bubbly gurgling sound from Victoria. Constance then wept in the dock as she described how the CPR didn't work. There was no heartbeat, there was no breath. She was completely limp. I held on to her for a couple of hours on my chest. I wrapped her up in my headscarf and said some parting words over her and then put her in the little bag. I was toying with the idea of cremating her body so the authorities wouldn't find her. She said that she was worried that people would think that she was some sort of evil monster or murderess. I had her in my jacket. I hadn't slept properly in a few days. I fell asleep holding her, sitting up, and when I woke up, she wasn't alive. When I woke, she wasn't alive in my jacket. I believe I fell asleep on top of her, but I literally didn't. She didn't. She didn't make any crying or movement, and when I woke up, she wasn't alive. Then I was holding her in my jacket. That's how I usually held her, but I think I fell asleep crouching over her, and she passed away. I wanted to turn myself in at the time. I've been debating it. Obviously, it's 2 months later now, but I kept her body for a number of reasons. Number one, I'm sure you've seen the soil on top of it inside the bag. Because I wanted, firstly, I've been debating whether to hand myself in, which I wish I did earlier, but the whole media presence and everything is kind of terrifying a little bit. And also, I kept the body because I wanted to have an autopsy done. I didn't bury her because I wanted to have a proper burial, but I couldn't get a proper burial until I had an autopsy. So I've been carrying around not knowing what to do really. I didn't want to bury her in a forest or some random place because I wanted her to have a proper burial, but also because I was concerned. If animal might eat her, that would affect the autopsy. She also told the court baby Victoria had the clothes on her back, a very warm, waterproof onesie. She outlined how the couple had planned to smuggle their daughter to Europe after she'd been born. My number one concern was to keep Victoria. I'm a good mother. I'm an excellent mother, actually. She deserved my love and attention. The plan was to go abroad with Victoria, to get away from the services in this country and my family. We would lay low in the UK until we found a way of getting us and Victoria out. The plan was to try and go abroad legally, or find some people who would smuggle us abroad illegally. Get away from this country and in the services and my family. But unfortunately there were preventatives from going abroad. She added that plan B was to remain in the UK but lay low. When asked to elaborate, she told the court she wanted to keep Victoria until she was 3 months old and then give her to a carer who could then try to get her abroad. She told the court that she would have paid this person to get Victoria out of the country. She said it would have been a carer, a nanny or something. If there is a will, there is a way. You can always find someone to help. She also told the jury that she had sought help from Ian Josephs, the guy who advises parents on how to oppose or evade social services. She said that they'd intended on finding a flat to live in, but were shocked when someone approached them and asked if they were the 2 people from the news. We didn't think we were on national television, and that's when things kind of went downhill from there. But she's always had clothes and nappies and things to keep her clean. She was well looked after. She wasn't cold or anything. Everyone seemed to recognise us, jeering and pointing and taking pictures of us. So that's when we decided we're not going to find a flat, because anyone could hand us into the police. That's when we decided to get a tent at that point. So in order to save her from the services, then we would have to properly remove ourselves from society till we could find a house. She also told the court, was the onus on me? Did she pass away because I fell asleep on her? I wanted to say the truth because I wanted to find out how she died. Another thing she said was, if we were caught, they were going to say, where's our baby? They will pile up charges, and they like to prosecute, no matter how innocent I am. Mark has a violent rape conviction and spent 22 years in prison, so my fear was that they'd immediately scapegoat him, which is what they usually do. Constance's former defence barrister insisted that she wasn't a monster, but a grieving mother with a deep love for all of her children, like a lioness for her cubs. At one point in the trial, she called a member of the prosecution diabolical and heartless, as he started his cross-examination, asking her if leaving Victoria's body in the bag, which he said was filled with rubbish, was a despicable thing to do. She said, "Mr. Smith, you are diabolical. I found the way you cross-examined me really uncouth. You really are a heartless human being." One of the major things that went against him in the court was that footage of the bag being found with Victoria's body inside. I showed you part of that clip earlier, and it shows officers removing the contents from a little bag, or bag for life, and there is rubbish in the top of the bag. As they dig a little deeper, they find Victoria's remains, which were nestled at the bottom, hidden under a leaf of soil and leaves. When this footage was replayed, Constance got up and left the courtroom. Constance told the jury from the petrol station her and Mark walked to the train station in New Haven and then got a bus to Brighton Beach where they ate some food and put the packing on top of Victoria's body in the little bag. She also explained that Mark usually carried the bag with Victoria's body in it because I couldn't bear to. She also admitted to neglecting her own care during their time on the run. I think Victoria passed away because she was so loved, but I was actually neglecting myself. I loved her so much, I wasn't thinking about myself. I gave birth, but I didn't even have time to rest myself. I got straight in a car and was up and down the country in different hotels. I didn't allow myself to rest. I neglected myself, and that's why I fell asleep in that tent. At one point she became agitated when asked about a teddy bear baby grow Victoria was wearing in CCTV footage from East London, which was later among items recovered with her body that the prosecution had described as dumped. Constance insisted that Victoria was not dumped in that little bag for life, telling jurors, "It's awful, I know. The only thing I can say, if someone passes away, the immediate reaction is panic. Mark and I were not in a good place. We were in fear and grief. She was not dumped anywhere. She was with us the whole time," stating that they used the bag because they didn't have anything else. When asked why she didn't seek medical attention for Victoria, she said because she definitely wasn't alive. Constance Marten wept as she told the court. At one point Mark said, "Why don't we jump in with her and call it quits? Let's just all have a fire and say goodbye to life together." We had just had enough at that point. I did nothing but show her love. I gave her the best care that anyone would have. I don't think it's anything that I will move on from. I feel guilty because she was in my arms. I feel like it's not an easy thing to live with. Asked if she was concerned whether the weather might affect Victoria, she said, "Of course, because she's my baby. I was worried about her all the time. If I thought for 1 second the cold would affect her, it was too cold, or we didn't have enough items to keep her warm, we wouldn't have been in that position. Obviously, it would be preferable to be in a house. That's just common sense. But at no point did I think she's in danger because we took care of her. She was our pride and joy. She was very well protected and looked after." She was asked if she told Mark to say that he wasn't there when Victoria died. "Yes, I am very protective over my husband. I feel he gets blamed for everything," adding, "Experiences Mark and I have been through with the authorities have not been good, and a lot of the time he gets the blame for everything." Contrary to that, jurors also heard that Mark told Constance to tell the police that Victoria had not died in her arms because then she would be blamed. He advised me, "Don't say the truth on how she passed away," adding he was trying to protect my interests. It's not that I didn't want to lie to the police. I don't trust the police. Throughout the trial, the prosecution did what prosecutors do. They laid out the facts of the case in the opposite light of what Constance and Mark did. To paraphrase their stance, you don't put a baby you adore in a little bag for life, along with old rags and rubbish. You don't carry that bag for weeks while you eat sandwiches on the beach. This is not the behaviour of a grieving mother. It is the behaviour of a person disposing of a problem. This was not a tragedy of poverty. It was a tragedy of choice. They had the money to keep her warm, but they chose a flimsy tent and a reckless nomadic life. because their desire to hide from the law was greater than their desire to keep their daughter alive. If it were a tragic accident, you call 999. You don't stay silent for 36 hours while the police beg for the location of your child. You only hide the truth when the truth is a crime. They argued for refusing all medical care. No scans, no hospital birth, no checkups. Effectively signed Victoria's death warrant before she was even born. They called her belief system an arrogant obsession that blinded her from the obvious risks of an infant sleeping in a tent in winter. Prosecutors pushed, the evidence pointed to a devastating conclusion, and that was that Victoria had died not because of a single violent act, but because of a series of decisions made by her parents. Decisions that had placed her in extreme danger. A young baby girl who would still be alive if it was not for the reckless, utterly selfish, callous, cruel, arrogant and ultimately gross neglect conduct of these two defendants, who were the parents of that young baby girl. They put their relationship and their view of life before the life of a little baby girl. So that, in just a few words, is what this case is about. Rather than act in the obvious best interests of a vulnerable baby, and one that they should have cared for and looked after, they decided instead that they knew best. They decided that in the middle of a cold winter, in a cruel and obviously dangerous weather conditions, that they would deprive the baby of what he needed. Warmth, shelter, food, and ultimately safety. They essentially went off-grid and lived in a tent with hardly any clothes, no means of keeping and remaining warm and dry, and with scarcely any food. Their selfish desire to keep their baby girl led inexorably to the death of that very baby. With the prosecution claiming Victoria's death was likely caused by hypothermia due to neglect, and Constance and Mark claiming it was an accident of overlaying, the jury couldn't find any answers from the pathology, which couldn't be certain of the cause of death, but stated that both were plausible possibilities. The court also heard from witnesses like a member of the public, Mrs. Mason. Mrs. Mason had been to Stanmore Park in Brighton for some fresh air on the 19th of February. She was on a mobility scooter and her husband was walking when she saw a tent near Stony Moor Way. I noticed a tent. The tent was royal blue. It was not very big. I just thought it might be an hiker. My husband had walked ahead of me and I shouted to him, "Come over. What's that tent doing over there?" He said, "Dunno. Someone is sleeping out in the cold tonight." I was taken back by it and then continued on my scooter. Further on, she then noticed a mother with a baby. When asked if she noticed anything about the baby, she said the mother was focused on the baby. Her eyes were totally focused on that baby, and my eyes went from her to the baby. The baby was in a sling. She was holding her around the baby's head to steady it. She said that the child was very pale, didn't make any sound, and its head was wobbly, floppy, and unsteady. She admitted that she was very surprised to see a child that had no hat, socks, or booties on, and was only wearing a cardigan and leggings. Which I find quite interesting that, it's wearing a cardigan, which I'm sorry, but there's a bit of contradiction. Is it a sling or not? Because that's pretty descriptive. But anyway, she said that the mom looked tired and she felt very sorry for her. A few steps behind was Mark Gordon. He looked at me and acknowledged that I had looked at the baby and gave me a smile. When asked if she thought that the baby was alive, she said, "I do think it had died. It was dead." Now that's pretty much it for what was said in the trial. There is a journalist, however, that went to both trials and he said quite a bit in a piece, which I think is quite relevant for this segment. In his writing, he's talked a lot, especially about Constance and Mark's behaviour and their seeming lack of respect for the process. The writer says that Constance and Mark were highly unusual defendants, often talking during the proceedings despite knowing that their conversations were disruptive. At one point, while a witness was giving evidence, Constance sent a note to the judge asking, "Could I nip out for a coffee as we're falling asleep?" They reported that Constance and Mark were often excited to see each other when they were brought up from the cells. Constance's face would light up when Mark appeared, and at times she'd even blow him a kiss. They were affectionate. When Constance became tearful, Mark would put his arm out to comfort her. And at the end of trial days, they would sometimes say, "Love you," to each other. At least to this writer, it seemed like they were using the court appearances as an opportunity to see each other, and they were making the most of it. He goes on to explain that even before their first trial, their legal representatives kept changing, which was a running theme throughout. Sometimes they were sacked, other times they withdrew, other times they didn't even have representatives at all. Constance, for example, was represented by at least 14 different barristers throughout the 2-year process. Mark also changed his legal team and ended up representing himself, which even led to this strange situation of him cross-examining Constance. And even then he used that to complain that he didn't have the same access to a barrister, and he demanded a desk, power to make legal applications, an Archbold, which is a criminal law book. He repeatedly asked for more and more time to get his head around the case, again leading to longer delays, to the extent that the judge one day even remarked, "Do you want me to adjourn for 3 years while you do a law degree?" And there were other delays. It's reported that Constance once refused to show up because while in the holding cells at the court the previous day, someone in the next cell was shouting abuse to her, shouting things like child killer. And then there was that time that Constance was apparently giving evidence when she suddenly blurted out to the jury that Mark had a violent rape conviction, something that hadn't been told to the jury to prevent bias. After the jury had hastily been ushered out of the courtroom, the judge declared, "This is plainly a deliberate attempt by the defendant to sabotage the trial." The retrial lasted 4 months. Then after roughly 25 hours of deliberation, on the 14th of July 2025, the jury had reached its verdict. When it came to the moment of delivery, there was silence. The clerk asked the defendants to stand, and they refused. The charges of concealing a birth and perverting the course of justice had been held from the last trial. The new verdicts in this trial were unanimous. Mark Gordon, guilty of gross negligence, manslaughter. Constance shook her head and crossed her arms. Constance Marten, guilty of gross negligence, manslaughter. At that point she looked at Mark intensely as he leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. Now, throughout this trial, Constance had made another act of defiance that really didn't help her case. Midway through the second trial, in 2025, Constance Marten's defiance reached a peak when she appeared on the cover of The View magazine. In their own words, The View magazine is the award-winning independent platform dedicated to amplifying the voices of women impacted by the criminal justice system. The feature was entitled Surviving Serco, Serco being one of the companies in the prison service. And again, this is something that's massively been reported on a very biased angle. It's reported that this article is her moaning about how she's been treated in prison and about the judiciary system. It's reported in a way that she thinks she should get better treatment. But honestly, that's not how I read it. I read it as if it had been written by someone who has journalistic qualifications, journalistic experience, and maybe even further aspiration of working in that field. From my perspective, it's an article written to document the conditions of prison and the court process, especially from someone who is supposed to be on trial. Here is some segments of that writing. Whether on remand or not, it's every human being's inalienable right to access a fair trial, a legal team, and a dignity in the process of justice. It should be a given necessity that remand prisoners like me have access to a legal team and I'm able to get enough rest between long court days to attend my trial. This is a problem that affects female prisoners more harshly and disproportionately than our male counterparts. Bronzefield, where I'm held, is 2 hours away from London by a prison van. The knock-on effect is that Serco, the government transport defence contractor that has a prison transport contracts in this area, squeezes as many women as it can into one van that can carry prisoners. Yesterday I got back from prison at 10 p.m, being made to do these 17, 19-hour days with little or no rest. No food, but I'm expected to be alert in the dock. I think it really prejudices my case when I'm falling asleep in front of a jury when I decide to attend. But then when I don't decide to attend because I'm too tired, it reflects badly on me. It makes me seem like I care so little about my trial that I'm falling asleep. That's just not true. My life depends on the outcome of this trial. So you can see how easily that is to twist that she's moaning that she's tired, when in actual fact she's just documenting that the way that these court transfers are done, defendants can actually be really tired in the jury. If they don't go because they're too tired, that looks bad on them. If they look tired in the dock, again it looks bad on them. So I suppose she is moaning, just not in the way that the media have made her out to be. To read it yourself, just type in The View Constance Marten. There is also an audible version that someone's done. In the days between them being found guilty, but before the sentencing, Ian Josephs, the guy who advises parents on how to evade or oppose social services, talked to Sky News. He recalled talking to Constance when she had her 2 children, and she was desperate to stop them from being taken into care. He said that she was acting out of desperation, both when she called him and when she went on the run with Victoria. In his words, if your child runs into the middle of a road when a lorry is coming and you're trying to save it, that's the sort of frame of mind she was in, to try and save a child from being taken. Not run over by a lorry, but taken by social services, which is nearly as bad. So the final sentencing was on the 15th of September, 2025. And even at this time, Constance and Mark's antics continued. The judge accused them of sharing notes, instead of concentrating on the submissions of Constance's barrister. I did also read that at one point a pen had been taken off her, saying that she weren't allowed to write down what was being said, and she demanded that she weren't, but it were her right to have a pen and write notes, so the pen was given back to her. During the day of sentencing, Constance's mom attended and gave a witness statement for Constance. He said she was horrified at how her daughter had been characterised during the trial, saying it did not reflect the daughter I remember. She said her inquisitive and adventurous daughter grew up into a determined woman who never shied away from standing up for what she believed in. She said her daughter was determined and courageous. She stood by her friends at school, as well as being full of humour and warmth. She also had a fragility of nature. For all her brightness and bravery, she often doubted herself. She struggled with confidence and self-worth, but her loyalty and passion for others were unwavering. I was horrified by the way the court and the newspapers have portrayed her. The cruelty of the labels used does not reflect the daughter I remember. What I do know is she showed sheer determination when it came to fighting for her children and Victoria. It is in my sincere hope that when considering her future, her courage, loyalty and deep sense of fairness are not overlooked. In a letter read to court, Constance's stepdad said, I have known Constance since 1998, when I met her and eventually married her mother. I had a close relationship with her until she met Mark Gordon and became estranged from the wider family. Constance is a rather fascinating woman, fiercely independent, at times rebellious, but with a big heart, much empathy and a keen sense of adventure. She's fundamentally a very generous and kind person. Even the Marten family housekeeper also wrote a letter that we read out. She described Constance as a sweet, polite and thoughtful young woman. She has a genuinely kind-hearted and caring nature. I've always admired the way she treats those around her with respect. Constance always stood out for a positive character. In my eyes, Constance is a wonderful person with many admirable qualities. For Mark, his defence said he suffered a great deal of upset and anxiety when Victoria's older siblings were taken into care before she was born. They told the court, he says that the children being taken away affected everything, affected their whole lives, and they were suffering a trauma, and he accepts that poor decisions were made, which he very much regrets. He said he will live with this for the remainder of his life. In regards to mitigation, Constance's barrister submitted, the sorrow Miss Marten feels is incalculable. She has from an early stage accepted that her baby died as a result of something she did. The fact weighs heavily on her conscience and will do so for the rest of her life. We submit that this court can accept that our sadness and remorse as entirely genuine. The sorrow and grief of Constance Marten is described in Dr. Hiller's report. Miss Marten experienced mild depressive episodes within the context of the depressive disorder at the time of the assessment. She continues to meet diagnostic criteria for a complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It is very likely that Miss Marten's CPTSD was present during the period and triggered by the death of the baby. Miss Marten's reported behaviour following the death of Victoria might be consistent with the process of grief, complicated by trauma. In the opinion of Dr. Hiller, he says, in my opinion, Miss Marten demonstrated a history and current signs of symptoms of CPTSD. Her disorder did impair her ability to make rational choices and to understand the nature of consequences of her actions. In her desire to keep Victoria, she neglected her. There is no suggestion the harm was intentional, and Miss Marten has paid the ultimate price. So the judge began the sentencing by placing the case at the highest possible level of legal blame for the manslaughter by gross negligence, categorising the manslaughter as one of high culpability, Category A. That placed the starting point at 12 years, with a range between 10 to 18 years. In aggravation for the both of them, breach of a relationship of a trust responsibility that extends well beyond the duty of care. The victim was vulnerable, and that victim does mean Victoria. Planned and considered offending, failure to heed previous warnings, attempts to conceal evidence interfere with the investigation, the previous care proceedings, no genuine expression of remorse from either of them, although they have expressed sorrow about the death. An extra aggravating feature for Mark was his previous convictions in America, and that also adds on offending while subject to the sexual offenders notification requirements, and failure to report his whereabouts whilst the offending was taking place. The fact that Constance had no previous was obviously a mitigating factor for her. The judge went on to say there was significant information about them from the judgments in the family court proceedings. In relation to Mark, they include the allegations of violence towards Constance in 2019, but also said, "It's important that I acknowledge that in those same proceedings, there is material to show that the care provided to your elder children has been noted to be of high quality." The pre-sentence and psychiatric reports for Constance Marten painted a portrait of a woman who remained entirely detached from the gravity of her actions. The judge highlighted an unwavering arrogance within her evaluations, noting that she viewed herself not as the mother who had failed her child, but as a victim of a persecuting state. The article that she wrote in The View, Serving Serco, was also used as evidence of her self-absorption. The report concluded that her focus remained squarely on her comfort and the battle against authority. This psychological rigidity led the court to believe she possessed no true understanding of the harm she'd caused, rendering her a high risk of similar behaviour in the future. The reports regarding Mark Gordon focused heavily on his classification as a dangerous defender, a status cemented by his significant criminal history in America. Psychological assessments indicated a profound lack of empathy and a pattern of prioritising his own survival and desires over the welfare of those in his care. The judge noted that Mark's role in the relentless energy spent evading the police, despite the obvious risk to Victoria, demonstrated a persistent disregard for human life. Ultimately, the reports concluded his history, combined with the nature of neglect in this case, meant he posed significant and ongoing risk of serious harm to the public. So for gross negligence manslaughter, the judge stated in Mark's case there will be an extended sentence of imprisonment mounting to 18 years with a custodial term of 14 and an extension period of 4 years. The judge explained to him the dangerousness test had been met and therefore a life sentence was considered, which means he would have to do the full term and then apply for parole. However, the judge decided against the life sentence. But because he tested as dangerous, the bar being met for him to be released 2/3 of the way through his sentence is much higher than it would have been. And if he does get released early, like any other prisoner, he would still have to be on parole for the rest of that term. But for him, because it's extended, he would have to do another 4 years on parole. But because of that extension, if he serves the full term, then he's let out, he'll still have to do that 4 years on parole after his full sentence has been served. In Constance's case, the dangerousness test had not been met, so she received a determinate sentence of 14 years in prison. So with the manslaughter by gross negligence charges being the count 4, the other sentences were passed. Count 1, concealing the birth, 18-month imprisonment. Count 2, child neglect, 18-month imprisonment. Count 3, causing or allowing the death of a child. That will lie on file, basically meaning it's been put aside and a sentence won't be passed because it's already covered by the other sentences, which in this case is count 4. Count 5, perverting the course of justice, 5 years imprisonment. And this is the UK, so all of those sentences were concurrent to the manslaughter gross negligence. So at the end of it all, if you're still keeping up, they were both sentenced to 14 years. They might only serve 2/3, If they do, they'll be on licence for the remainder of the 14 years, and Mark will be on parole for an extra 4. 2/3 would be 9 years and 4 months. Throughout these 2 years worth of court proceedings, the organisation Support Not Separation were very vocal about their support for Constance. Now, you would think that this video ends here, but while I've been researching and writing and editing this case, a review which Constance Marten was invited to attend and share her experience has concluded. The results of that review is a 93-page document entitled Protecting All Vulnerable Babies Better, National Review into the Broader Safeguarding Issues Raised by the Death of Baby Victoria Marten. Now, I'll be honest, I had fully intended to do an extra section on this case. In that section, I was going to break down the entire case into my thoughts and my perspective, because there is a lot wrong with this case. The outline of my thoughts and perspectives are simple. Constance and Mark's convictions for manslaughter and gross negligence is correct. They should be in prison. However, it was entirely preventable. I believe in this case, as with many other cases like Fiona Anderson's, which I've covered in the past, the outcome was entirely preventable, and the situation was made far worse by the social services and the way they treated Constance Marten, or at least the way they treated Constance Marten's case. It's worth noting in the UK, 5,360 children aged under the age of 1, over 5,000 under the age of 1 are subject to child protection plans. In England, that includes 1,430 unborn babies subject to protection plans in England. This review, if I've understood it correctly, calls for the urgent action for change and addresses pretty much all the areas where I think the system failed. So although this next little bit isn't going to pinpoint all the details where my separate video would have, I'm now going to go through the findings of that review. The review found systematic gaps in post-removal support, which left Constance and Mark isolated and unsupported after their first 4 children were taken into care. Sex offenders like Mark Gordon should be subject to tougher notification requirements, including telling police if them or their partner becomes pregnant. Despite the clear evidence of DA, including Constance sustaining life-threatening injuries while pregnant, professionals were confounded by her insular and codependent relationship with a sex offender. The review said Victoria's arrival was part of a repeated pattern with devastating consequences. Panel chair Sir David Holmes said a critical lesson to learn from the tragedy was that keeping children safe by removing them with just cause from their parents only serves to protect those children. It does not address the root problem, and it does not prevent the same set of circumstances from happening again. Indeed, it may increase the risk of harm for the next child, not yet born, not yet conceived. The report called for a greater focus on supporting parents to process the loss and grief of successive child removals, noting there is currently no help available. Parental coping strategies will vary from individual to individual, but successive removal of Constance Marten and Mark Gordon's children may have reinforced their perception of harm caused by the children's social care, making the concealment of Victoria feel subjectively rational. A key lesson from Baby Victoria's story is clear. To protect vulnerable babies better, we must support their parents too. That may be hard to hear and hard to understand, but it is essential if we are to stop cycles of harm from repeating. Constance Marten told the review panel that nothing was done to support her after losing her children, and suggested a confidential service, separate from the local authority, should be available to parents. Asked how well child safeguarding agencies understood the impact of having a child removed, she said, "Not at all. The local authorities see their role as complete once the removal is achieved. In fact, people can be supported and can change, which should result in children being returned and supported." She went on to describe seeing a child at a contact centre is one of the most painful experiences for a parent to endure. However, there was no support when leaving the contact centre despite the obvious distress. The report found Constance Marten's confident presentation, denial of abuse and reluctance to engage with services all masked her own vulnerabilities. Asked by the review how contact with child safeguarding agencies made her feel, she said, "I was given ultimatums rather than true assistance. It felt like they were using the powers of the state coercively rather than constructively. It felt in a way that there was a flowchart which would ultimately result in the removal of my children, step by step. My mistrust of social services is not an innate feature of my personality. It developed due to my dealings with them." Asked by the review how well child safeguarding agencies support parents dealing with the impact of having a child removed, she said, "Nothing was done, but I wonder whether there should be an independent and confidential service to assist parents that is separate from a local authority." She also said that while she recognised that hospitals had safeguarding duties, current practices may actually prevent parents from seeking timely medical care and actually causes further harm to children. When asked how well the NHS maternity services understand and respond to reasons for late disclosure of pregnancies, she said, "In my case, the late disclosure was because I knew that the hospital would flag me up and contact services who wanted to remove my children. Anecdotally, I know other parents who were resistant to taking their children to hospital because they fear they would be presumed guilty until proven innocent. Whilst of course hospitals have safeguarding duties, the current stance may actually prevent parents from seeking timely medical care and therefore actually cause further harm to children. Some parents with mental health problems or disabilities are fearful of seeking antenatal care because they know that instead of being supported, the social workers will use their presentation at hospitals as evidence of being an unfit parent." I want to point out here that this is a very in-depth document. Again, it's 93 pages long. For every issue that's raised, it also highlights the cause of the symptoms, the reason it's a problem, and the solution. In all, the review found removal of children will leave parents feel isolated and unsupported, and that aftercare should be given. Sexual offenders like Mark should have tougher notification requirements regarding pregnancies. The system often reacts to non-engagement with escalation rather than trying to understand the root cause. Risk management. The review identified critical moments where the risks were posed by Mark Gordon were underestimated because the system operates in silos. There's an oversight of families who move homes, a failure to cater for mistrust which had been created by past encounters. The maze of services. It captures the confusion parents feel when they told they need therapy by one service, i.e. social services, while being told that they don't meet the criteria from a service that's going to give it them, aka mental health services. And psychologically impossible trust. The review states, for the parents who have had children removed, it can be psychologically impossible to trust or engage with the same professionals who facilitated that removal. The lack of a safe space. It finds that there was a lack of independent and confidential services separate from the local authorities where parents could process their trauma and rebuild trust. The report recognised that the system made it worse. The report concludes that the system's rigid approach inadvertently fueled the very behaviour that it was trying to stop. The review summarises by stating that while Victoria's parents were solely responsible for her death, the system failed to unlock the pattern of non-engagement and instead relied on reactive interventions that ultimately left the child isolated and at risk. So where is Constance now? She's in H&P Bronzefield still. That's in Ashfield, Surrey. It's the largest female prison in Europe. Because of its size and its proximity to London and the southeast courts, it often holds some of the most high-profile female prisoners in the UK. Rose West used to be held there, but she's since moved. It now holds Lucy Letby and Joanna Donaghy, both of which are on whole life tariffs. And I'll tell you something, I'd rather not be a person in that prison with a privileged upbringing. Prison officers now have to maintain constant surveillance over Constance, or at least they did to start with, due to mounting concerns that she was about to do harm of herself or face violent attacks from other prisoners following a sentence. Authorities launched a ACCT, Assessment, Care in Custody and Teamwork, file on her to track her mental state and physical safety. Just a few days after the sentencing, the Daily Record reported a prison insider said, She had reacted to the sentence very badly and thought she would get off much lighter. Since returning to jail from the Old Bailey, Constance has basically cowered in her cell and tried not to come out. She knows she is a target because of her high profile and notoriety. The staff have offered her a few jobs that would be considered plum roles inside, including as a cleaner, in the library and in the kitchen, but she has turned them all down and won't do anything. This is probably because she doesn't want to mix with others. But if you're a librarian, for example, you get the pick of books and DVDs, or you'd get an extra food in your kitchen. These are incentives most people would give their right arm for, but she isn't interested. She's also asked for a move off the unit, so she is away from child killers, like Letbe and Batul. She thinks her crime is much less serious than theirs, and views them as killers, although that's exactly what she is. It has been explained to her that she is in the same category as them, and would be in much more danger on a different unit. The severity of her crime and her sentence does not seem to have sunk in, and she's a bit deluded. Constance will not engage at all. Officers are monitoring her really closely, which they have to do under the terms of the ACCT, and trying to ensure she doesn't come to any harm. They have to come up with a post-sentence plan for her, but it is really difficult because of her behaviour. Since that was reported, she has took up a job cleaning Unit 4, and as you can imagine, that has led to her being mocked quite a bit. Obviously, everybody knows her upbringing, so other inmates are constantly mocking her, calling her the poshest Miss Mop in the country. And that's all I have for you. Thank you all for sticking with me through this case. It's been the longest and most challenging case I'll probably ever cover. You're all the bestest, and I want you to know that without you, I literally wouldn't have been able to cover this case. I would also like to send a massive thank you to all my members and Patreons. I know some of them weren't all that interested in this case, but they've stuck with me and the channel regardless. I can assure you it's now over, and we're going to get back to other cases. It'll be a long time before I pick up another deep dive. Thank you all for your support. Please do let me know what you think down below. But we do have the same disclaimer as always. This is a true crime case. It's a real story involving real people. Those real people have real families and real friends. So although I don't want you to comment and I don't want you to share, do so with sensitivity. All I'm saying is I love you. Take care of yourself. Take care of those around you. And I'll see you real soon. Bye.